Okay, we good to go? All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this workshop session to order. This meeting is called to order. We'll do an attendance roll call, starting with Councilmember Aldama.
Here.
Councilmember Clark.
Here.
Councilmember Hugh.
Here.
Councilmember Tomacha.
Here.
Councilmember Turner.
Here.
Vice Mayor.
Present.
I'm present. Everyone is present. So moving to the very first item, Ms. Bauer, would you introduce item number 1 for us, please?
Draft Parks and Recreation Master Plan preliminary findings.
Good morning, afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. We're very pleased today to bring you an updated report on the efforts being put forth by our Parks Division regarding our Parks Master Plan. And with this, I'd like to turn this over to our Parks Director, Jim Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Phelps. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. It's a pleasure to be here. This item was originally going to be brought to you in March and, of course, was interrupted by the COVID incident and the cancellation of meetings. But we're happy to be here today to provide you information. This is not an action item on the agenda today. This is a checkoff point where we can bring you the information on the findings we've done with our consultants and our community about the master plan process. Later this summer, at the end of the summer probably, we'll bring you the next step, which will be the exciting part. Today will be interesting also, but the very exciting part will be a draft plan where we'll be seeking council direction and action and recommendations. And then later in the fall or early winter, a final master plan. So today we have consultants with us from Denver, Colorado, Carrie Conold, who's with Greenplay, and she's our prime consultant who's going to do the report today. She also has with her Dave Peterson from her company, and Dean Chambers, who's from a local engineering firm here, J2 Engineers, who's done a lot of park work in the state. We'd like to do this presentation. It's about 45 minutes. We take all the questions you have, if you want to do them during or after, or hold them to the end, either your preference. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie to get started.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see all of you again. Was anxious in March to come out and present the information that I'll have for you today, but here we are in June, and we're happy to say that we've been talking with staff and just making sure that we're all on the same page, and are ready to present to you guys what we have found about the city of Glendale as it pertains to the world of parks and recreation and the services that you guys provide. So as part of that, the purpose of the project is to do just what we're doing today, is to look at the existing services and the condition of things as they relate to parks and recreation. We are determining what the needs of the community are, and then we want to reflect the current conditions, which is interesting given where we are with COVID, and anticipate future conditions, what that might look like. And then, of course, we will be incorporating the relevant plans that are in existence into the draft master plan. But today is all about findings. So where we are in the process. So at this stage, we're at findings and visioning, which is what's circled up there as number 2. We were here previously for information gathering, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But what I want to share with you is that at this findings and visioning stage, what we're doing is presenting all the data to you guys and looking for comments. There's no decision point today. Again, as Jim has indicated, that point will come in September when we bring the draft plan, because that's where the recommendations will actually live. And so we'll be back in September looking for action at that point. But today, it's about listening and then hearing any responses to the things that we present. So from there, I want to help you guys understand what we did in information gathering in that first stage that led us to where we are today. So in October, we were here and we did on-site public engagement. We had a number of different focus groups in a public forum. We did Facebook Live. We invited different stakeholders. We spoke to each of you. We spoke to staff. And we obtained input. And in that, we had 103 contacts, quantitative data. So the random sample invite survey which you'll see in some slides when I present survey data. That's what's called the invite responses. And I think that that's important for you guys to keep in mind as we look at some of the survey data, because your invite responses are slightly different from your open survey. And the reason for that is typically because when we get to the general public, where we open it up to just anybody, it's more pointed communications to people like folks in the recreation database. So they're already interested in Parks and Recreation Services. Whereas the random sample survey, it's actually getting to people who don't use Parks and Recreation Services as well. And that's really important for us to hear from those folks, okay? So with
Mayor?
that, yes?
Mayor?
Okay, it started over here first. Good.
Thank you. That's what I want to talk about is public engagement. South Glendale is typically not as participatory. They don't necessarily have access to computers that you would find in other parts of Glendale. That the households tend to be more socioeconomically low to mod. And so how did you make an attempt to outreach those who primarily are the silent majority of South Glendale that we typically never hear from?
Yeah, well, and with the invite survey, that's what that attempts to do, is because we don't send that
Yeah,
out.
but the invite survey was online, right? It was
No.
over the internet.
Sorry,
What if-
the invite survey was mailed to households, both rented and owned. So we
Okay.
make no distinction there, and it's a random sample survey.
Okay. And was that equally that would be the 276?
Yes,
Was
ma'am.
that equally distributed throughout the city?
It is, yes, so RRC is the company that we use to do that. And yes, so they use a system, they pull the zip codes and addresses from a service that they use from your voters who are registered in the city. And they sample those surveys. It's just random, they're randomly selected. So I could probably go in and find out where each zip code had those invite surveys sent to. In fact, I have a list of the zip codes that were sent to, but I don't have the number of which zip
That
code
would be
had
my
those.
question of the 276. Where did those respondents come from? Were they predominantly 85308 or predominantly 85301? I think that would be important to know because there's no way of getting around it. South Glendale is typically underserved. And so it's critically important that we get a strong representation of opinion from that area.
So thank you for that. And what I can do is work with RRC to get some information that will answer that question, and we'll deliver that information to Jim, who can then share it with the council.
Mayor?
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Mr. Aldama and then Councilmember Tomacho.
Thank you, Mayor. Joyce shared my my comments, so Councilmember Clark, thank you very much. Precisely what I was going to ask. It's important to know demographically where these comments come from. There's not a lot. I was hoping to see several thousand. This is too important of a document and a plan to make decisions based on 356, or these numbers that we have here. It's just absolutely not enough. Not any fault of yours to this extent yet, to this point, I should say. But it's very important to know demographically where the comments come from, and I hope that you guys track that because it's really important. Because if we were to find that demographically it was just from one area of the city, no matter which area, then I would be one to ask, we need to scratch and do over again. So, Councilmember Clark, thank you for bringing that up, and I just share the same sentiments.
Councilmember Tomacho.
Thank you, Mayor. How many surveys were mailed? We received 276, but how many did you send out so we know how many did not respond?
Quite a few, so 4,250.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So let's set some ground rules. Let's go through the chair with the questions and the answers, please. Okay?
Thank
Any
you.
other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Excellent. And so one of the ways that we have kept folks and folks who are interested in the project aware of what's going on is through the city's website. So there's a project page on there with information that's relevant to the process. And then staff, we've worked with them to email information about where we are and, you know, to let them know that this online survey was available. Or we tried to do a campaign on Facebook where we said, hey, if you've received the mailed survey, please fill that out. And you're right, of course, so, you know, if somebody is not necessarily connected with the city on Facebook, they may not have seen that, but staff surely did their best to make sure that they were utilizing the channels that were available to them to get the information out about the project and the opportunities for input.
Mayor?
Go
And that's my concern. I mean, seniors are not, you don't find a lot of seniors on Facebook, let me tell you. And I think there's got to be a way to reinvent the wheel, that we do reach those populations who typically don't participate. So I wondered, like, could we start thinking about doing something like maybe setting up a survey site or a kiosk site at maybe a local grocery store or drugstore in a particular zip code? So that and then we screen as they fill it out, and they have to be Glendale residents to fill it out, because obviously a grocery store may serve more than one local jurisdiction. But I think we need to be doing things like that to create more outreach to the inactive and disaffected part of the population that generally has no opportunity to make decisions about how their lives will be affected. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. All right, so I will take time now to go through different elements of our information gathering and those findings associated with these different elements. And we'll start first with demographics. And so I'm going to keep this very high level. What we looked at was utilizing the 2019 Community Profile Report supplied by the city, that your estimated 2019 population was 250,784. Then we applied as using Esri Business Analyst data that your 2024 projected population would be 272,960. So that gives you an estimated population growth annually of 1.8%. And this last data figure that I pulled, it indicates how many households in 2019 have children. And I pulled this because I was curious one myself. And the number is 37.5% of households in Glendale have children. And that's anyone under the age of 18 in their household. And when we think of Parks and Recreation Services, that obviously is important to the services that we provide. And so that's why I added this in here. I think it's also important, I don't have this in this report necessarily, but one of the things that we looked at with your demographics was different generations. And it's interesting, you have over 50% of your population is made up of Generation Z and millennial populations. So it's over 50%. That's some young people that you're servicing in the city of Glendale. I thought that was an interesting number. All right, so I want to go and touch base on these public engagement sessions that we held in October, where we, again, talked to members of the public.
Yeah, hold on a sec.
Yes,
I do have some comments with regard to demographics.
Pull your microphone down just a little bit. There you go.
Is that better?
Way better.
Okay. Okay, I went online and I got the 216 census data demographics. I couldn't find 2000 anything for the city or the district. And there are just some things that I need you to be aware of as we talk about demographics and what's going on in the city. I came up with totally different figures according to 2016 than what you cited for 2019. But there is one very startling figure. From 2000 to 2016, my district, the Yucca District, the population grew by 104%. So I find it astounding that you say population growth for the entire city for the next 5 years will be 1.8%. Projected annual growth, 2019 to 2024, is 1.8%. You know, it doesn't seem to jibe with what the information that I found. I do know, for example, in the Yucca District, there are over 4,000 apartment units right now. There are a minimum of 3 new apartment units coming online within the next year. There are 7 new residential subdivisions, and that does not include Stonehaven with 1,365 new homes. And the point I'm making is that I think the projected population growth for 2024 is off. I think it will be more than your projected 272,000. But I also am making the point, and I will pass this data around so that the council members can look at it. I only made 1 copy, I'm sorry. The point I'm making is that there is an explosion of growth in the Yucca District. And I think it's very important that you take note of that there are a lot of families out there with limited access to City of Glendale amenities. And I'll talk more about that further down the road as you go through your findings. But I just want to make you aware that the most astounding information to me was that between 2000 and 2016, the population growth in my district is 104%. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Excellent. So when we were here in October and we heard from stakeholders, and yourselves included, and staff, some of the takeaways that we left with were that, you know, it's really important to ensure that there's equity in delivery of services, and that's both in the quality of those services and access to those services, which is inclusive of your facilities and your amenities as well as programs. So we heard that, and then also having the ability to have the resources that are necessary to provide these services and to care for the facilities that are provided through Parks and Recreation Services is important. To maintain, care for, and improve what exists in balance with expanding any new facilities and services. There was a notion around personal safety in public spaces and preserving Glendale's character. So, from that, what I indicated before was that we use those focus groups and the stakeholder input and staff conversations and conversations with decision makers to help inform the questions that we ask in the community survey. And so with this, I'm just going to present some key findings out of the survey. And so some of these, and sorry, this is kind of hard to see on that screen back there. Hopefully you can read it, but what we heard, and there will be 2 slides here that I'll share with you, is that folks said, hey, let's improve what's currently offered and allocate resources that are necessary to improve existing amenities. And across different questions that we asked in the survey, we heard this notion of taking care of what we have. Then another one was that adding and improving restrooms and improving park amenities, so other things besides restrooms, things like benches and shelters, playground equipment, other components, these are ways that encourage people to use their local parks. And then 3 of the top future priorities were improving park amenities, providing additional walking and bike paths, and the provision of events and festivals.
Mayor?
Go ahead.
I'm just going to be a pain in the butt today, I'm sorry. And this is where I appreciate and agree with the future priorities, but this is where I will strongly advocate for the completion of Heroes Park. It is the only major amenity serving West Glendale. And to date, the park is still not complete. We still don't have sports fields. We don't have a recreation or aquatic center. and we do not have a fully functioning library. And those are elements that can be found throughout the city that are not available to the people in West Glendale. Thank you.
Mayor,
Go ahead.
members of council, Councilmember Clark. Again, today is just the findings from the public, and we won't even be drafting recommendations until the next phase that Jim referenced. And so I think the appropriate time in terms of weighing in from a policy direction will be when we come back here in the next 4 to 5 weeks, the actual recommendations. All she's doing right now is just sharing from the surveys that we've received, this is what they're saying. We're not saying this is what you should do. We're not saying this is what the plan should incorporate. We're only just sharing the actual data. Once we receive the feedback today, in terms of the needing information, we'll help craft a draft plan, which then will be a very appropriate time to weigh in and to say, we think the plan is out of balance here, it needs more here, it needs less here. So again, this is just the recommendations from the public.
Mayor, may I respond? Thank you, sir. I appreciate your comments. But I feel that it is critically important to represent not just my district, but Councilmember Aldama's district and Councilmember Yu's district. And I believe in being the squeaky wheel early. So I apologize if you don't think my comments are germane at this point, but I think they are a good balance and counterpoint to what you may have discovered from the survey. And I think Councilmember Aldama's point about finding where those respondents came from demographically may make a great deal of difference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll continue. So with the key findings from the community survey, again, this notion of balancing between improving current offerings and developing new sites and facilities was something that we definitely took away from responses that we did receive of the 632. And that prioritizing improving current facilities, when asked specifically which folks preferred, they said, we really want to prioritize improving what we have. Open-ended comments, they expressed the need to ensure that parks are safe, that facility-specific needs are met, and there was praise for the city's current efforts and what's being provided, which is always wonderful to hear. Many of the comments highlighted how important these parks and facilities and programs are to families in the Glendale area, and I think especially after and through this COVID experience that we're seeing anecdotally in our industry how very important these spaces have been for people to meet their health needs. So, also Thunderbird Conservation Park, Community and Neighborhood Parks, and the Foothills Recreation and Aquatic Center all received this high importance and high needs being met rating among facilities. And I'll share with you guys a matrix later in this presentation that talks about this, but those are some facilities that are definitely, they're important to people and they're meeting their needs, so that's good news. All right, so when asked specifically what would encourage or improve, so encourage your use of or improve your local park, these answers here: add or improve restrooms, and improved park facilities and amenities. Again, this is things like shade, picnic areas, other components that are park features. These are the things that people said, you know what, that's gonna encourage my use. And so I think, at this point, I wanna say that, adding or improving restrooms doesn't necessarily mean that we would come back and say you need a restroom in every park. That's not a best practice in our industry. But it is to say, through our analysis, we will come back and make recommendations about where those restrooms could be improved. So you'll see that in the next stage.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
On the open and the invite, is there any possibility of duplication where somebody that was invited also did the open too?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, somebody could, because they could get on to their computer and do that. But we monitor IP addresses to. And then if we see something from a same IP address, to make sure that those answers are not duplicate answers or even similar answers, so that we don't get that loading of the ballot kind of thing.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you did address that already?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, we always do that on our plans. It can happen. Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that, there's a pretty good percentage of folks there, 53% and 52% responded saying, hey, these are the things that would get me to go out and use my park. All right, so here's that matrix that I want to share with you. And this is a cross-tabulation of data. And here we have this performance matrix of facilities. And so keeping in mind that this is not programs, these are your hard assets. And so we asked on here, for all these different facilities and facility types, and I want to show you over here in the high importance, low needs met, this is usually the area where we say, hey, this is your opportunity area. And so in this quadrant, we see for you guys aquatic facilities. Now, whether that means pools or spray features, that's to be determined based on wherever we see the need through our analysis. But what folks are saying is, hey, that kind of facility is important to me, and my needs aren't really being met. So maybe that's an area of focus. So we have that in that quadrant. Hanging near there, we have athletic courts and picnic areas and shelters, which we noted in the previous slide that that's something that people said, hey, that'll get me to go out and use my park more, or picnic areas and shelters and those kinds of features. Then on the right upper quadrant where it says high importance, high needs met, this is a quadrant where we say, hey, there's things that we need to continue here because it is working for people. And again, this is based on the responses that we saw. So community neighborhood parks, your existing trail connections that you do have, Thunderbird Conservation Park, your regional parks, Saguaro Ranch Park, and the Foothills Recreation and Aquatic Center, as well as playgrounds and the Glendale Adult Center, but to a lesser extent. And you can understand that because the Glendale Adult Center, that's more of a niche facility. Not everybody is going to be using that, but it is important here, and people generally are having their needs met. And then we see to the bottom right side in that quadrant, low importance, high needs met. And I think that this is really an interesting thing to see with you guys, because we see these matrix presentations all the time, and usually we see something in here and we say, hey, this is where you actually want to divest, consider divesting. You guys have nothing there. I think that's really interesting, okay? So as a consultant, I wanted to point that out to you guys. Low importance, low needs met. These definitely are your more niche facilities. And we see these as opportunity points for things like partnerships, and it might be with a nonprofit. And I know there already some partnerships are in place, and that's probably appropriate for many of these. But I do want to point out that it's not, we do have opportunity here to look at different types of uses of these facilities because they are generally not as important to the greater public, and their needs are not necessarily being met there. So what's the opportunity there? And we have quite a few facilities over there. All right, so now I'm gonna move over to programs. So same idea of this matrix. And I think this is fascinating from my perspective because everything's pretty tight in here. That you're doing special events and festivals. People generally say, hey, this is important to me, and generally speaking, my needs are being met. It's a little bit on the close to the low needs met, so that to me says, hey, there's opportunity for improvement there with special events and festivals. I think it is important to point out the outdoor and environmental programs that folks are saying, this is important to me, but there's not very much opportunity. So we will, certainly that's a takeaway for us. Other things that you see in here, low importance, low needs met, is agricultural displays and activities, and then youth and team programs. Knowing that some of this may be because they're getting their needs met in other places, not necessarily by the city, okay? So we asked about priorities, and here what we see, again, there's some interesting key, repetitive things that we're starting to see in the survey. And again, that's improved park amenities, bike trails and walking trails, events and festivals, and connectivity came up again. So we can start to see what's really important to folks who responded to this survey. All right. Then we asked, hey, how important are these elements for the vision of Parks and Recreation in Glendale as you think about the future? And while nothing necessarily was incredibly low, we do see a tier here with 4.3 and 4.5 with the open and the invite survey responses saying, hey, ensuring that our parks and recreation facilities have a high level of safety. Okay, now that can be actual safety and perceived safety. There's a difference there. But they want to be safe, they want to feel safe. And then investing in maintaining and repairing our current and existing park and recreation facilities was right up there as well. And then it goes down, so to a lesser degree, keeping in mind in the future that ensuring that facilities and programs are affordable for all residents also resonated with people. Okay. All right, so then we moved into what we call a comparative analysis. Historically, these have been also called benchmark analyses, but basically what this is a look at your peer agencies. And so in order to do that, we looked at Gilbert, Peoria, Scottsdale, and Surprise. And what we see when we do different analyses is that we have here acres of parks per 1,000 residents. And when we look at this, we have Glendale here at 8.87, so that's 8.87 acres of parks per 1,000 residents. If we take out Thunderbird Conservation Parks and the 3 linear parks, we're at 6.04. Gilbert is at 3.74. Peoria even less. Scottsdale similar to Gilbert. Surprise there by Peoria. And then when we do this comparative analysis, what we're also looking at in our industry is looking at what's called the National Recreation and Parks Association Agency Performance Report. And when we do that, we're looking at averages amongst self-reported agencies. So in our association, Surprise, Scottsdale, Peoria, Gilbert, and Glendale have all provided information to NRPA. And then they make this report that averages out and gives us this NRPA median. Now, this is the median for the whole country. This is not the median of these agencies that you see as your peer agencies. But I wanted to point out that throughout the country, the average agency provides 10.1 acres of parks per 1,000 residents. Okay. So then we looked at operating expenditures per park acre. And what we see here is that Glendale is at just over 3,000, Gilbert at just below, or just over 6,400, Peoria nearly 12,000, Scottsdale just over 17,000, and Surprise at 83, just under 8,400. And I want to point out here that the NRPA median here is 6,750. So that gives you an idea of what other agencies across the country are spending. And this is operating only, but this is your operating expenditures per park acre.
Mayor, Mayor, excuse me. Could you give us that NRPA number again, please?
You bet. It's 6,750.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Then we looked at full-time employees.
Mayor?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Getting back to your slide on acres of parks per 1,000 residents, and you say that the NRPA is median from throughout the country. Well, there are many parts of our country that are definitely not urbanized. I can think of Wyoming, for example. And yet that is all lumped in with urbanized areas. Do you have an NRPA median figure for urbanized areas exclusively?
Mr. Mayor, so NRPA does not provide distinction, but in their agency report between that kind of segmentation of agency type.
Well, that's my problem. If you're going to benchmark, you need to be benchmarking against like situations. And how can you benchmark against Yosemite National Park versus New York City? You know?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The NRPA is for municipal agencies only, not for state or federal agencies. And also, the reason that we selected Gilbert, Peoria, Scottsdale, and Surprise is so that you could be benchmarked against your peers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so then we looked at full-time employees per 10,000 residents. And in Glendale, we're just under 2 full-time employees per 10,000. Gilbert's at just over 6, Peoria at 11, Scottsdale 14.75, and Surprise at 4. And again, the median for the NRPA is 8.3. So I just wanted to present this information around full-time employees. This is something that we look at. It's pretty typical for us to look at when we're doing our analysis.
Go ahead.
Thank you. On the FTEs per 10,000 residents, is that department-wide, or is that includes management, directors, all the way up to, and, all the way up to the top and bottom? Or just people who are out, like, doing park maintenance?
Mr. Mayor, that is for the full department.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. On this slide, the FTEs per 10,000, how does it allocate or compensate for when you have outsourcing your park services and you have outside companies providing that?
Mr. Mayor, so that information is not included. This is typically, and this is self-reported information. So, it depends on the agency and how they reported the information. But I would, having done this myself, reported for NRPA from an agency, you're doing only what your staff is in terms of your budget. You are not necessarily including your contracted staff. And I want to make a clarification, Mr. Mayor, that for Glendale's self-reporting, that was only for their Parks and Recreation staff, not for the full department, because this is a Parks and Recreation-based database. So I just wanted to be clear on that.
Mayor?
If I could, is there a way to get that kind of information about whether Scottsdale, for instance, has over twice as many employees in their Parks and Recreation? Do they do any outsourcing? Do they utilize outside agencies, or do they have all of the employees in-house? Versus Glendale, where we have less than 2, to what extent are we using private contractors to do the work? Is there a way to get to that?
Mr. Mayor, I think that those conversations would need to be amongst the peers themselves to get into that information. I mean, obviously, one of the findings that we've, I'm not necessarily sharing that with you guys today, but one of the things that we know is that contracted services for the department in terms of Parks and Services in Glendale is high. We know that they are utilizing contractual services, which of course does play into this. So it is something that I'm aware of, but in terms of figuring out if each of those agencies does something similar, I think that that's something that needs to happen at the staff level.
Sure, that's still on. Thank you, Mayor. Do you have data for part-time employees per 10,000 residents?
I do not, Mr. Mayor.
Because that would be interesting to know as well, because I know that department does make quite a bit of use of part-time staff, especially to run a lot of the programs and that type of thing. So that might make things look a little more balanced. Would it be possible to get that data for us?
Yes, I believe so, Mr. Mayor. I think that that's something that we could look at.
Thank you.
Mayor, members of the council, so again, remember this number it is equated into a full-time equivalent. We'll look and see what we have in terms of our contracted staff. Probably the best way to look at this from a context, however, is go back to the prior page, because the prior page does reflect the cost of all of our contracts as well. So when you look at how much we spend per acre, that $3,000 number does include not only our employees and our internal costs, but it includes our contract cost as well. So likely what you will find is we'll get the additional information, but it's not going to skew our 1.9 employee per 10,000 to the point to where all of a sudden we're not in last there. We'll still likely be towards the bottom of the rung, but we'll get that information and we can forward that to you here as quickly as we have it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now I'll move on to the segment of information gathering that we did around inventory and level of service. And so our Dave, who's here with us today, and Dean as well, they spent time out in the field, and they visited every park site that the city of Glendale maintains and operates. And some of the takeaways from those assessments was that, you know, generally the parks and facilities are well maintained, but there definitely is a deferred maintenance backlog. That's something that we could tell from our consultant eyes. There are some unique properties combined with your standard neighborhood parks, which are distinguishing. There's a need for updating and continuing park identification signage and branding. There's numerous playground servicing and court services that are worn and dated. So those are just some of the takeaways that we had when we were out in the field.
Mayor?
Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm going to take us back to about 2 years ago. I had a council member item of interest that I think at the time some of the council members in the room here were supportive of it. And it was, I asked for a disparity report. And so I met with staff. At the time, I met with Ms. Jean Moreno. And so I remember very clearly and not vaguely an assurance by the city manager, Jean Moreno, and from our parks director that it was best that that be ran in this process. And I had trouble swallowing that pill because I wanted a separate report. And so I was assured that it would be in this process and that it would be in its own separate report. And that report was to bring back the disparities of parks in all the districts compared to other parks. So for example, if the Yucca district had a park that was a family park and was filled with ramadas, benches, and other parks that say in Saguaro didn't, then we would determine whether that's a disparity or not. I went to the far lengths to scope out that work with our staff. I wanted to know everything from programs to conditions of ball fields, amount of ball fields, amenities, benches, etc. I don't see that in here. So with that said, I'll give you the credit where credit's due. You've done some good work, and you and I met for a couple hours about this, and I was assured that there would be something in here. I don't see anything. So is that coming? Is that being worked on? Or as the city manager said, we're just here as in high level, but I don't see that here. Can you explain?
Yes, so Mr. Mayor, what you'll eventually see,
Okay.
there will be basically what, in our industry, we call like a gaps analysis is what we're conducting here. And so through the inventory and level of service work, and I'm going to move to this next slide, but what we do through this analysis is go into each park, and Dave can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, and maybe it'd be best for him to answer some of this, but I'll do my best for now.
Well, Mayor, if I may, so that's fine if it's, I don't see it in here, but if you're going to speak of it, that's fine, but where is that specific report separated within this process? Because that's what I was assured, like pretty close to a promise that it would be there. I think it was one of those that kind of zipped me up for a little bit so I wouldn't be too loud about it. So I accepted it and said, yeah, absolutely, it makes sense, but I don't see it. So is it coming?
So, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to say that a specific disparity report is not necessarily part of our scope, but it is the work that we do under a different name, I would say. So is it okay if I invite Dave up to maybe speak to his work briefly so that we
Well,
can
just a
address
real-
this issue?
Yeah, real quick question. Are you going to provide in the future what he's asking for by a different name?
I think I would like to say, yes, it will get at the information that you're looking for around what we're calling equity, right? So around equity across your park system. Yes, we are getting to that.
And I think that's what you're asking for, right?
Yeah, Mayor, thank you for clarifying. So really, that's it in a nutshell. So I'm waiting for someone from our staff, and it sounds like someone's getting ready to speak up to say, yes, that is going to, because we did add it to the scope. At least I brought it in several meetings and said, this is the scope of work. And so I hope to hear from Mr. Burke here that
Consultants and see if we can address it as a specific pull-out that would address your concern. But we were going to try to bring it forward in the recommendations in the draft plan. That would be the next step.
Mayor, if I may, so my interpretation was very clear. It wasn't an interpretation, it was that we would identify those items or facilities or programs that lack in other parts, not just my district, and anywhere, because I want to ensure that what your report is saying is that it's important to those who partook in the survey that we maintain what we have. Absolutely. Anything we have that's just a great facility, that's maintained, let's keep going. But there are disparities within our park system, our program systems, and our athletic fields and programs. And so I was very clear. It wasn't a guessing game. I was very clear. So I would like to see it separated so that we identify, so that not only our council and our mayor, but our community can say, wow, yeah, there's some work that needs to be done. And that'll drive what our constituents want us to do when we talk about budgets and bonds for this type of facilities. But if we don't identify that, I know it could be a sore thumb, but it's a reality. We have to bring that forward. So very clear, I'd like to see it separated.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, thank you. At this level, there's a lot of detail and minutia that we could get into, and so we refrain from doing that because we could be here for a very long time. But as part of the work that we will provide, it is a part of it. I think you'll be pleased to see what comes forth in our next phase. And it'll allow you to have information to help prioritize and set budget aside to do some things when we talk about equity. Okay. All right. So,
Mayor, if I may.
Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I concur completely with Councilmember Aldama's remarks. I think that is a critical component of a needs assessment for this city. And I'm disappointed in the way that it is being handled currently. But I want to talk about your parks assessment summary slide. I keep seeing the need for updating and continuing park identification signs rear its ugly head every month or so. Where in this survey in God's green earth did citizens identify that we need to improve the branding and the signage in parks? I believe this one is completely staff-driven and should be identified as such. So could you point me to the material that you've already gone over that shows where the public identified a need for renewed branding of signage in the city?
So Mayor Weiers and Councilmember Clark, what you'll see in here is that this inventory and level of service assessment was conducted by our team members, so by Mr. Dave Peterson and his team member. So this is consultant-driven, and something that, again, we see from our profession as something that can help allow citizens to know where their services are being provided, what their dollars are going to, and what services are available. So it's something that we see as a best practice, was not necessarily anything that we asked specifically from the community survey.
Mayor, if I could continue, I will just make one last comment. I think it's far more important to our citizens to, for example, numerous playground surfacing and court services are worn and dated. That's far more important to them than new signs at every park. Just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor, to that point, having served on the Parks and Recreation Commission, in fact, chaired it in one of my past lives, there was a time in which all of our parks were very nicely and very uniformly signed, so that no matter where you were in Glendale, if you drove past a park, you knew that you were in Glendale and it was a park and that we were proud of it. And it wasn't a very expensive, in the scope of things, project. So I do feel that signage is important. It helps to identify the quality aspects in our neighborhoods and let people know that, yes, they are in Glendale. And for the cost of having a good signage, uniform sign program on all our parks, I think there's benefit to it. Lots of these other things we're talking about are quite expensive, but just uniform signage that, helps say we're proud of this park and lets people know that they're in Glendale, I think does have value. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I want to show you in this neighborhood access map is that folks who live within a 1 mile drive to or bike to a park amenity or component, as we call them, and or within a 10-minute walk, what you see here is that in this map, it shows the coverage that people have access to within those ranges. And please note that this is a heat map. So what we're showing is that, and this has to do with how we do our analysis, which looks at park components. It doesn't simply identify that you have a park located here. What we do is we go in and look at a park and say, hey, this park has A, B, C, D through G components, and then we evaluate each of those components, whether it's a 1, which is low, a 2, which is average, and a 3, which is high, and we say, hey, this is where all your components are, and this is what the result is. So the green indicates that that is a park facility, and the deeper orange shows that people within that area have a lot of access to a park component. Now, it doesn't take into account what quality that is just yet, but that's where we start to get there in our, when we look at recommendations around where do we need to improve this map so that maybe we have a better look at this dark orange and change what this map looks like over time with improvements so that we are talking about an equitable system. But from our perspective, again, like this indicates that for the most of the city of Glendale, they have access to a park component. Again, we're not talking about quality necessarily, but access to a park component, which in our world is very important. That's why we are in the business we're in. All right, and so with Dean Chambers from J2 Design, Engineering and Environmental Design was introduced earlier in the meeting, and I want to note that specifically, J2 went out and visited Murphy Park, Saguaro Ranch Park, Thunderbird Conservation Park, Thunderbird Paseo, Skunk Creek Linear Park, and Grand Canal Linear Park. And some of the common issues that they saw out there were some issues around lighting, maintenance, identity again, connections and general access to these facilities, program alignment, and restrooms were some of the things that they came back noting as some opportunities for improvement in these various areas.
Mayor, thank you. What would program alignment look like?
Thank you. So what that would look like is making sure that if there are opportunities, for example, at Thunderbird Conservation Park, and I mentioned this because in that matrix for programs, we saw outdoor environmental education as a potential opportunity area. It may be that we want to make sure that what's happening out at that property is the right kind of program to be supported at that facility. So that's what we talk about program alignment, just making sure and ensuring that things are appropriately used. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, programs assessment. So we were provided data from the city's Civic Rec software report, and we looked at registrants by program area. And I wanted to show you here that out of a total of 12,802 registrants, that 37% of those are going to aquatics programs. 24% of those are adult sports leagues. 15% is youth recreation camps and athletic programs. And then you guys can figure out the rest. But I want to point out some of those bigger chunks there for you to see where the resources in recreation programming is going to. So when we looked at the data that was supplied to us, and we look at things like wait lists as well as other program data, like where are these being held, what we saw is that there's an interest in programs at the Glendale Adult Center and in your aquatics programs, which you saw with that 34% in the slide before. When we looked at this, we saw that demand may warrant considering growth in your youth recreation camps. That might be an opportunity area for expansion. And that a number of the classes that are offered amongst these various categories, they run at 33% or lower, and that some of those oftentimes are then canceled. And we want to point out, though, that a number of those programs that are being canceled are actually contracted programs, so they're not necessarily being offered by the city, but they're offered through the city. And so what we come away with that is, well, maybe we need to talk with our partners around process, and maybe we don't want them to put out a bunch of programs that may not fly, so that the reputation of the city isn't that the city always cancels classes, because it's really not necessarily the city who's canceling those classes. It's just an overload of programs because the contractors want to try and get business. So from our perspective, that's an opportunity to figure out maybe a better system there. And then some of the other things that we looked at, of course, is budget. Like that's a big piece there. And what we see here is, in general, the department, and for this we did look at the whole department, is looking at between 3.08% and at its highest is 3.39% of the general budget, just overall. So I just ran these numbers and wanted to point out that they are right there around 3% of your general fund. Some of the things that we found when we look at staffing and the organization itself is that we have a high turnover rate in parks maintenance, and that retaining employees can be challenging. Overall, for the department, again, knowing not just Parks and Recreation Services, but for the department, in fiscal year 2020, there were 63.5 full-time employees in the department. Okay. And I want you guys to know that, a part of what we're looking at as we start to move forward is also incorporating trends that we see that are relevant based on what we have heard from the public and from stakeholders and decision makers, as well as what we see in our industry. And so some of the things that we're seeing are how parks and open space and recreation services benefit communities, how we have opportunity to address homelessness in parks. We know that, for example, here in Glendale, we have Bonsall Park and Sands Park are some areas where that's a concern. So how do we deal with that? What can we do proactively? When we look at recreation programming, some of the things that have come out of the recent COVID experiences are increased virtual classes, making those available, or esports. What does that mean? And esports means like gaming, online gaming that people are engaging in. So esports is something that's up and coming. And of course, the events and festivals, because we heard that as a community driver from respondents. And then we're going to look at conservation practices where it's appropriate, and then opportunities for environmental education, and of course, marketing and branding there as well. So as we do this, I want to reiterate that we will be back here in September with a draft plan, which you will be able to read in full. We'll come back and I'll present the goals and the objectives from that plan and make sure that we are all on the same page. And we will incorporate at that point anything that we hear from you as a reaction to those recommendations. I think, from us, this is at a phase point where, a milestone where we transition then into action. And so I appreciate your time today and hearing what we've presented and your comments, and we will continue to move forward.
Good.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for your work. While I'm not pleased, that's just my opinion, but thank you for your work, and it was an absolute pleasure meeting you and meeting with you for a couple hours back when you started this. So, and thank you to our staff too. I look at this as one of the most important things next to just passing our budget and hiring our city manager. This is an extremely important process. I don't know why, or I should say, hindsight is 20/20. Now that I'm looking at the process we're going through and what we've come up with and what you may bring forward, I don't know why we're not treating this like the census. We should be going door to door and sampling neighborhoods in all of our district and making sure people are engaging. The numbers of the survey respondents is not enough, nowhere near enough, in my opinion, to create a plan for the future of our parks and the amenities. I really think we needed, now that we look at it, I would ask for the council to consider adopting a budget that would allow this group or our staff to get out to the community, just like the census does. You really need to get to doors. This isn't enough. We can't move forward with this plan with just that amount. I think it's maybe 1,300 participants, nearly, not a fraction of a district. I would ask for us to take a step back and find a way that we can get to people's homes and sit and speak with them. This is not gonna work. It's not gonna work. It absolutely is not going to, folks. So we need to look at maybe not necessarily scratching it. We've got some good bones and structure here, but we need to treat it like the census. It is that important. It is for the next 25, 30 years what our parks are gonna look like. So we need a budget to get a consultant out to homes and start sampling and getting their input. So good work. I just don't think it's enough. Thank you, Mayor.
Tomachak.
Thank you, Mayor. I think it's, generally speaking, probably a problem across the country that you send out 4,200 surveys in the mail and you get 276 back. I don't think that's probably that unusual. I don't think going door to door is going to work, and I'll tell you why. Because people don't like, first of all, most people won't even answer their door anymore, for one thing. But I did suggest this when we first started talking about this, was to do intercept surveys at the park, where you can talk to people who are at the park, using the park. That's not that complicated and not that expensive. I know they did that years ago at Thunderbird Park, and nothing ever became of it. It was when we had a different director, but they were trying to put together a docent program where we'd have volunteers to help with managing the park, trying to bring some kind of programming into the park, that sort of thing. But I don't support the idea of going door to door, because I think we're gonna end up with the same thing that we have right now. But if we could station people in parks around the city and try to get a little more data of the people who are actually out using the parks, know what the issues are in the park that they're using, I think we might be able to get a little bit better data. And like I said, that is something that I suggested that we try, to try to get a little bit deeper dive than just putting something up on the internet and sending stuff out in the mail and then ending up with, I don't know, about 600 responses total for a city of 250,000 people. Mayor, if I could, I have another thing I'd like to say is, on the retention is challenging. I actually have asked for this information. Do you have a percentage of what the turnover is? Because I am waiting for some data on that exact topic, on what the turnover is in our Parks Department, because this all has to be a wheel that can keep on turning, and we're going to be allocating a lot of funding for this project, and we need to make sure that we have all the right pieces in place, and know exactly what we're dealing with. If the turnover continues, this could really derail us trying to get this done, so.
All right, well, let's let the city manager answer that question.
Yeah, Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Talmachoff, you had requested that information. I just received really the bulk of the data that I was looking for. I'm putting together a report, and we'll have that out to you very shortly.
Okay, but what I asked was, in the report, Mayor, if I could, they said turnover is high. They must have some data that they use to make that statement in this report. What is the data that you use to make the statement in the report?
Thank you. So for that, that was from our discussions with staff, so it is staff-driven, but also from looking at past budget data. I could look to see, look at my raw data and provide what I looked at in terms of looking at past years. So I looked at the past 3 years to see what the numbers were. For parks maintenance specifically, because I was looking at department information, but for parks maintenance, I just asked the question of the team, hey, where was this turnover happening? And so parks maintenance was the response. So what I would suggest is when the city manager has that information and provides it to, if it can be shared with the director and then shared with us, I would be happy to include that in the analysis.
Mayor, members of council, so yes, you had asked for a 2-year look. We've now identified all those who have left the organization. And what we've done is we've gone back, which we think is important. We do exit surveys with all of our employees, and we tried to identify what the reasons were for people leaving the organization. So we're compiling all of that. What I can tell you is that over the last 24 months, we've had 6 full-time employees that have left to go elsewhere for employment. We had 1 who retired from the system. But I'll give you that breakdown because we wanted to show you the kind of the granular detail about what their reasoning were for leaving and seeking employment elsewhere, and also kind of their exit survey information. So we're real close to having that information, Councilmember Talmadge, and we'll get it to you real quickly.
Okay, thank you.
If I could, on top of that, can you also identify the difference between part-time people that are no longer there and full-time people? That might be helpful, because I know that part-time, there's been, my understanding, quite a few people that have come and gone. I want to find out if we're counting them also.
Mayor, members of council, again, we looked at the full-time employees. We can certainly go back and look at our part-time. That's a little, and there's a lot more turnover, as one can imagine, in part-time. But I do know that over the last 24 months, we've had 6 people leave the Parks Division to seek employment elsewhere. 1 that actually retired, and I'll work with Jim to see if we can identify information on the part-time. We don't always do an exit survey on part-time employees, where we do for our full-time staff.
Right, and I just wanted to know the number of part-time. So if I could go back one step to what Councilmember Tomachoff and Councilmember Aldama was talking about, surveys. Have we done any surveys on our water bills? Because, I mean, we know it's going to, not only just our citizens, but businesses, but I think that might be a quick way to maybe see if there's a huge difference, or possibly end up with the same percentages, but that might be a quick way that we could do that. Just a separate slip inside the bill, or if the people do it electronically, and ask them to, please, this is important. This is how we're going to, make the decisions for the next 20 years. So, just a thought.
Mayor, if I may, yeah, absolutely, and I agree with the both of you on your ideas for communication. So furthermore, we have, I believe, 3 to 4 districts, school districts in our city, Peoria, Tolleson, Glendale being a few. I think Glendale Elementary has about 13,000 students. So if we haven't stopped to ask our students who are of age to make, some sound, give you some information, sound information, then I think we need to do that as well. So the point is we really need to branch out to more people than just what we did. So I think the schools would be helpful, high schools as well.
All right, if we could, we'll go back to Councilmember Melner. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. In regards to the survey, surveys are what they are. They're basically a point in time question of how things are, and they're not 100% accurate. We're never going to get a real accurate statement on where things are, but we get a generalization of where we need to go and what we need to do. And I think that's the purpose of the survey. So I appreciate what has been done, and I think the better question to ask is, what is the validity of the survey that we have? Is it demographically, as we have already brought up here several times by several council members, is it demographically accurate? Is it statistically accurate? Does it really statistically, the number that we got in, does it statistically prove, is it a good survey? I mean, there are statisticians out there who could tell you whether or not this is a statistically accurate survey. And I think that's the direction we should ask. Rather than just push more surveys out, let's ask, what is the statistically accurate way of doing this, and then proceed and maybe do some of these things that have been suggested if we feel it is warranted. But first, let us know, is this a statistically accurate survey, and what do we need to do to make it more accurate if we need to? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I concur with everything that's been said, but especially Councilmember Aldama's remarks. You and I are on the same page this afternoon, I believe. I want to thank you for the work that's been done by the consultants. I find some of it valuable and some of it not so valuable. But we are about to embark upon an investment of approximately $10 million a year in upgrading existing parks and hopefully also completing Heroes Park. Why I consider parks so important is because they, in great measure, determine the quality of life for every resident in Glendale. They are also, when we talk about marketing, they are a marketing tool for possible locates within the city. The bosses, the CEOs of companies, want to know that their employees have access to good quality recreation because that is an attractant. And when we do not pay attention to those things, it does not serve our economic development well, knowing that there are substandard parks, substandard amenities, and people would question why they necessarily want to locate next to such a facility. I think there's also another question that nobody is thinking about, and that is there must be a bunch of people who don't use our parks. And my question is why? Is it because walking 10 minutes to a park in July is not convenient? Because you use a 10-minute walk as part of the rationalization for how the community is served by parks. I haven't done a 10-minute walk in July in Arizona in 50 years, and I'm not about to start now, and I'll bet there are a lot of people who would avoid that like the plague. So parks not only have to be well-maintained, be a quality of life amenity for our residents, but they have to be convenient as well. And I think that's an element that was looked at but kind of glossed over. How really convenient are some of these parks to our citizens, especially when you talk about the smaller parks? One of the complaints that I get repeatedly is about a city park over in Rovey Farm. And they complain about two things. And they're like ambivalent on the issue, and that's the issue of parking. Some say there's no parking. Now, this park is supposed to serve a square mile. Okay, and there are over 800 homes in this square mile. And somebody who lives at 83rd Avenue might not want to walk all the way over to 87th Avenue to use this city park. They're certainly not going to walk it. So on one hand, I hear a group of people from that area saying there's a lack of parking at this park, and therefore a lot of people who could use it do not. On the other hand, I hear from a second group of people who say the last thing we want to see is parking at this park. We're already getting outside leagues, which is another issue that I'd like this city to look at. How can we prevent outside leagues from using park facilities that are designed to be used by neighborhoods? Because what this Rovey Park experiences is cars parked all up and down Rovey Avenue for league play in this park. So those people don't want parking. That's the last thing they want, is to encourage more league play in their park. So I think that's an issue that has not been addressed either. How do you deal with the issue of outside entities who are usually for-profit, who come in and use the city parks for league play? But to get back to my central issue, our parks are supposed to be the jewels of the community. They are supposed to be inviting, clean, safe, and a true amenity for our residents. And when they are not, we have failed to do our job. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Am I on? Yes, okay. So I would like to address Councilmember Meliar's question around the survey. And so the invite survey is a statistically valid survey. So we had 6.49% response rate. And from that, there's a margin of error of 5.9, but it is a statistically valid survey. So thank you for bringing up that point.
Mayor, may I just ask what I heard and see if I heard it right?
Well, you heard it right, but that's not the way she meant it. 6.9 of everyone and 5% of the people surveyed was the,
So a
Just
res-
reiterate the
I'll
two
do that again.
percentages.
So we had 4,250 invite surveys were mailed to randomly selected households across the city. And of those, we had, I think, 276 respondents. And so if you do that math, that is a response rate of 6.49%, okay? So from that, we have a margin error of 5.9%, so plus minus. That's what you take into that. But it is a statistically valid survey, and it's weighted. So there's that. But yes, I mean, we would work, RRC will not release the report until we have enough that we can say, yes, with validity, it is a statistically valid survey. That's what we were hired for. That's why RRC was on our team. It's why we worked with staff very hard to try and get the reminders out to people to say, hey, if you happened to receive that survey in the mail, make sure you fill it out. And we didn't know which households those are, so staff didn't know. So they did these general blasts around, please take that survey if you received that in the mail. But so does that clarify what your question was?
Yeah, just
Yes.
for me, who is mathematically challenged, Mayor. So if I look at any of the percentages of the respondents' surveys in those graphs that you showed us in the beginning, I could plus or minus those percentages by 5.9%.
That is how that works, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got it.
Hey, Mayor,
Go ahead.
let me ask a question to the consulting and put you on the spot. What was your name again?
Carrie.
Carrie?
Carrie.
Carrie, thank you so much. I'm
Yeah.
going to put you on the spot here. So first of all, you did your job. You did what you were asked. You brought in statistics, and our surveys meet that criteria. So that's great. You did your job. So now there's the integrity piece of your organization. And so the question to you is, do you feel with the respondents that came back, the amount, do you think that's enough for you to tell the city, this is enough for you guys to make strong decisions based on the next 20, 25 years? Are you prepared? Can you answer that question? So can you tell the city right now and the residents and council members that the responses we got back are enough for you to continue with the draft plan and get it approved by your city?
So thank you for that question. And my response, Mr. Mayor, is that our information, so the community needs survey is one element of the input. Also, again, what we heard from the public when we were here in person is another element. Everything that we saw that I shared with you from this presentation around the comparative analysis, with the programs assessment, with a look at your financial stance and the organizational structure of the department, that all together is what allows me to make recommendations in the next phase.
So I guess, thank you for that, Mayor, if I may. So I didn't really answer the question. Was there, based on the survey response, is that enough for us to create a plan to spend millions of dollars on these parks?
So we will provide you with a plan, Mr. Mayor, that allows you guys to make decisions around what you will prioritize and how you will spend your money. We will make recommendations around what we suggest based on everything that we've seen together. Ultimately, the decision is up to you guys. So we are making recommendations, and I will say, yes, I do feel like we can make recommendations. And this is a high-level, strategic, systematic master plan. If you were talking about a site-specific plan, I would say, you need to really talk to your neighborhood, and you really want to make sure that you're talking to the people who use that particular facility. We're looking at a systematic plan, which is at that 30,000-foot level. We do our best with what we have.
Mayor, thank you for answering, because that's really what I wanted to hear. So I appreciate that you stand by that, because it's really important to know that your organization stands by your work. But this is systematic, but it also is, when you narrow it down to a district, it does affect families and those individual parks or facilities. So while it's systematic, it still narrows it down to an individual park or facility and individual families. So I don't think there's enough respondents. Not your fault. I just thought that maybe you would tell the city, you just don't have enough here. I mean, we would recommend that you maybe go out. And I didn't hear anything from you guys in recommendations to go out or further communicate to the community. So, but thank you for answering. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor,
Councilmember Tomachoff.
Thank you, Mayor. Is this 6.5%? Is that a low number? I mean, is that a low number of participations in this random survey?
So I will say, based on what we see across the country, and it varies community by community, that I would say from my own professional experience that what I saw here is on the scale of maybe your public's not as interested. I've seen communities where there is over 10% response rate, and I would call that quite good. But we see all kinds of things. I've seen lower than this. This is one that you guys know. This is one of the biggest challenges, is getting people interested, especially at a high level when they don't know it's specifically going to affect them, because we're at we are up here. We aren't at that site-specific level. So I think that, sure, could you at 6.49% do better? Maybe.
Mayor, so is 6%, 6.5%, would you say that's below average or average? Or
I appreciate the question. I do not feel comfortable saying where that is. I would rather RRC, who is the subconsultant for that portion of the project, they see things across the country that they keep track of the different percentages. For me to be able to say that, I don't have the information to make an informed decision from there.
Okay, thank you. Mayor,
You're
if
welcome.
I could, we've got to do a better job of engaging our citizens too. I mean, that's on all of us in this room. We've got to do a better job, because we really want their input. We want them to be engaged, and that's something that we've really got to work on. It's disappointing that many people just probably toss a thing in the trash. So, thank you.
Mr. Phelps.
Mayor, members of the council, maybe this would help answer the last two series of questions that were asked by Councilmember Aldama and Councilmember Tomachoff. The draft plan that we put together is not going to be based solely on the surveys. Part of what they've done is they spent a lot of time with each individual elected official to kind of capture your understanding and your needs within your district. They spent a lot of time talking to staff. Your team that live and breathe the parks side of the house every day, day in and day out, and that's part of their data point. They looked at the budgeting and comparative data, and so they spent a lot of time diving into that part of it, and then they also did surveying from the public. The challenge is, we could make a decision, and this would be a council-driven decision. You could say, we'll put it out to a poll, and whatever the majority of the citizens say they want to do, that's what we'll run with. The challenge of that is, that's where we start getting the difference between equality and equity. Because it's going to be almost impossible to be able to say, even if we doubled the amount of people that respond, that we're able to effectively deal with the equity issue versus the equality issue. So the park recommendations that will come about will be based on talking with the public, talking with your parks team that every day has to go and understand what the needs are and what works, talking with our elected officials who are elected by your district, in your district by your representatives, and you obviously have a high level of understanding, and it'll be that. So there's really a number of factors that will go into this. Now, I think we've heard that you'd like to see maybe if we can get a little bit more data points from the public, and we'll come back to you with some recommendations on how we can do that. So I want to be clear. If that's what the council, has a desire to do, and it sounds like a number of you have weighed in on that issue, we can do that. But the parks plan is going to be a series of data points. And a lot of it's going to be weighted on the conversations that they had, quite frankly, with our elected officials and with your staff. Because you guys live this day in and day out. You know your facilities. You know your constituents really well. And so it's really a blending of those things. So we'll come back with a plan about how we can increase, but I would strongly caution about saying, let's let the public decide how we want to do that. And here's the reason why. Somebody asked a question, do you use the park? I don't use the park because in my neighborhood, we have open space that's provided as part of my master plan neighborhood. And I'm at the age where, quite frankly, my wife and I don't do a picnic in the park. There was maybe a time in our life when we did, but we don't do it now. If you surveyed me, my input has to be weighted differently than the young family who every day goes to the park and uses the park facilities. So just speaking to Councilmember Tomachoff's kind of the intercept surveys, that's a great tool to see how are parks being used, and should we weight a little bit heavier, perhaps people who use our parks on a daily basis. But we're also then forgetting, what if there are people who actually would use the park, but our parks aren't oriented to the things they like? So the intercept surveys would only tell you those who are using the parks, but if somebody said, I want to see a whole bunch more bicycle amenities or skateboard amenities, and I don't go to the parks because they're not offered, we'd have a hard time surveying them through an intercept. So it's what I would encourage you to understand. We want to capture your vision for the parks. We want to make sure you understand what we're learning from the citizens that are there. And then we also want you to be able to get input from your parks team that have to go out every day and maintain. And I think they see some of the good parts of our parks, but they also see some of the warts and some of the scabs and some of the things that aren't maybe the best part of it. So we'll work on a plan to get you more data points from the citizens, but it's really, our plan will be driven by a combination of efforts by our consultant that has spent a lot of time both in everything from individual meetings, survey groups, meeting with staff, and meeting with the general public.
Mayor. Thank you,
Actually,
Mayor.
I think
Oh.
Mr. Turner was next.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councilmember. And I think that, as I understand this, my thoughts are somewhat similar to what the city manager's just expressed. I certainly would love to have had twice as many people respond to the survey. But in my understanding, what that would help us know better is whether or not 53% or 55% or 52% of the population want us to add restrooms or improve our restrooms, which was 53 was the number that the survey gave us. That it also gave us the number that 18% want better Wi-Fi connectivity. Twice as many respondents is not going to tell us that, oh, we were wrong, it's not restrooms they're concerned about, it's Wi-Fi. The real number is, completely different. It's only going to fine-tune these general numbers that we've received here. So when we have some significant separations of what people feel about our parks, what they're looking for in our parks, and that sort of thing, a bigger pool of responses, provided that we, our random sampling was good to start with. A bigger pool of responses is only going to some degree, narrow that margin of error, but it's not going to flip the results, from 20% to a 30 or 40 or 50% category. Okay, it'll narrow it down with just a few percentage. So we always like more data, but do we have enough data here to have a high enough level of confidence? I think we do as far as the survey portion of what this is. And as was just mentioned, that the intercept surveys are going to give us more information from people who are currently using our parks or a given park, but it won't tell us about the people who aren't. And we owe just as much to them to figure out how can we provide a park program or a recreation that they're interested in. So we have to have, other ways of getting to them and still, without risking that we invest too much of our concern, that doesn't sound quite right, but we don't overweight the concern of people who are more motivated to respond than we do people who are less motivated to respond, because we have to represent them all. So I guess data-wise on these things, more would be great, but it's not going to make a world of difference, I don't think, as to where we point our resources. So I'm okay at this point with what we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't think anybody here said that we wanted more participation because we didn't want a majority of those in the survey would make the decision. Because at the end of the day, we're going to make that ultimate decision. So I know who makes the decision, and we hope that it's based on the constituents' needs. So I don't remember anybody saying that, but what I'm saying is that when I said going door to door, it's so that we can assure that demographically we've spoken to and we've listened to those in those demographic areas of what their needs are. We may not even use all of their input, but at least we went to every demographic area of the city, said we asked and we listened, and here's some input from you. We may make a decision based on, let's say, the Yucca District demographic on needs for another park or vice versa. So I'm not saying that the majority will rule on that. All I'm saying is you need to get to parks, you need to get to homes, libraries, schools in different demographic areas to get an equal demographic input. So I just want to be clear and we have to do a better job on that. I don't think we did. I don't think we took it that far. So it's not the majority. It's more of just sampling the area. So thank you.
Mayor?
Go ahead.
One of the other things I was going to ask about is you briefly mentioned weighting, that the results have been weighted. Can you explain that process to us and how you might have done that?
Well, I'll do my best to. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. So again, this is part of our sub-consultants' work when they go in and do the weighting. So I'll take my best stab at it. So what we do when we do that is looking at your demographics, and then we look at our survey responses. So I didn't include these slides into the presentation because, again, there could have been so much that I put in here, but needed to keep it at a high level. But from your age of respondents, and I'm going to speak about the invite only because, again, that's the statistically valid portion. But for example, when we look at age of respondents, 29% of the respondents were under the age of 35, okay? And then we had between the ages of 35 and 44, it was 17, and so on and so forth, because we ask the demographic block in the survey. And when we do that, then we weight that compared to what your demographics are, so that we get a representative sample, which is part of what makes it statistically valid. So that's the weighting portion of the survey. And I'm not a statistician, so I apologize. But
Mayor, if I could. So I think how this concept works is, for instance, you gave us a data point a little earlier that 37.5% of our households have children under the age of 18, which would mean that 62.5% don't have children under the age of 18. So if in the responses that we get from the random survey, we get back, the responses come in not with 37.5% of the responses having children under 18, but say 42% of the responses had children under 18 and the others didn't, the results would be shifted a little bit to favor, to better mirror the actual population of the city. And that can also be done for income or for any other data point that you get. So a good firm, which I trust you are and you contract with, will make those kind of adjustments to better zero in on, in a perfect world, what the results would have come back to make it a more clear reflection of the community. Thank you.
yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. So that is correct. That is what RRC does. And, we've been working with them for, 25 years. I mean, a long time. And that is how that works. So there, like I said, there was a demographic block on there in the survey that speaks to age, gender, household income, all the typical things that we find in the U.S. Census. And that's what they compare that against to weight that information. Thank you.
Okay. Was that, are you finished now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If there's no other questions, we're going to move on. All right, thank you. Ms. Bauer, can you introduce item 2?
Council committees.
Mayor, members of the council, here to provide staff report is Deputy City Manager Brent Stoddard.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, council members. As you know, June of each year, the council reviews their council committees, makes appointments for any vacancies, and handles any reappointments as appropriate. The council currently has 4 committees: the Government Services Committee, the Temporary Business Council Committee, and the Temporary City Code Review Committee, as well as the Audit Committee. For purposes of today's workshop, the council only needs to make appointments to the Government Services Committee. The Government Services Committee consists of 3 members of the council. The current members are Councilmember Joyce Clark, who has served as chair over the last year, Councilmember Jamie Aldama, and Councilmember Lauren Tolmachoff. Your council guidelines state that council members are eligible to serve 2 full 1-year consecutive terms. So Councilmember Clark, who was appointed in June of 2018 and is now finishing her full 2nd term, will create a vacancy on the Government Services Committee. Councilmember Jamie Aldama and Councilmember Lauren Tolmachoff were both appointed in June of 2019, and so they are eligible for an additional 1-year reappointment at the discretion of the council. So with that, Mayor, I'd hand it back to the council for your discussion and appointments to that Government Services Committee.
Mayor?
Mr. Hugh?
Yeah, if nobody wants to speak up, I wouldn't mind going back to the Government Service Committee.
Okay. All right, well, we're not actually going to vote on this, is that correct? Consensus is what you're looking for?
Mayor, members of the council, yes, just by consensus, you will make those appointments, and then at the first meeting of the newly convened Government Services Committee, those members will select the chair from amongst their group. But there's not a formal vote. You will just appoint those members via consensus at this workshop.
Mayor?
Yes.
So I just wanted to clarify, so it is in our council guidelines that you have to serve the 2 years? I'm just curious, because I serve on Valley Metro, plus I serve on 2 committees at Valley Metro, the audit, plus I serve on the Audit and Finance Committee here, the Business Subcommittee. So I'm happy to move off of the Government Services Committee if somebody, at Westmark, I'm on a committee, happy to move off the Government Services Committee if somebody'd like to take my place.
So Mayor, Councilmember Tolmachoff, you're not required to, you're just eligible for an additional appointment. That's obviously at the discretion of your willingness to serve and the discretion of the council to reappoint you, so nothing's required.
Mayor? And I'll mention that I'd like to continue my my position on the Government Services Committee, so.
And if nobody's going to volunteer, I guess I'll stay on it. But thank you, everyone.
Okay, so do we have a consensus with Mr. Hugh and the 2 staying on?
Mayor, we could give Mr. Hugh 2 seats. If Councilmember Tolmachoff would like to move off, I'd be willing to move on, but that, of course, is up to the council.
I'm on the Audit and Finance Subcommittee for Valley Metro is very time-consuming. So, and then the Audit and Finance, so if you wouldn't mind, and if it's okay with the rest of the council, I'd appreciate it.
Any other discussion? Okay, so consensus, Mr. Aldama to stay, Mr. Turner to take Ms. Tolmachoff's place, and Mr. Hugh to come on. Okay, there you go.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on to item number 4. 3 has been pulled. Item number 4, can you introduce that, please?
General obligation bond election.
Mayor, members of the council, Here to provide staff report will be led today by Vicki Rios, our Director of Budget, or our Assistant City Manager, and Lisette Camacho, our Director of Budget and Finance.
Mayor, members of the council, while they're getting ready, just wanted to introduce a few people here that are going to be here and participating in our discussion today. As Mr. Phelps said, we have Lisette Camacho, our Budget and Finance Director. We have Mr. Jack Friedline, our other Assistant City Manager. And we have Lisa Baker, who is the Vice Chairman, couldn't think of the word for it, Vice Chair of the Bond Committee. And we have John Gears, who is also a member of the Bond Committee. And they're here to help us in the presentation and answer council questions about their process that they went through. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ms. Camacho.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. I would also like to add that we have Mr. William DeHaan, our bond attorney, here with us. Today, we're going to cover the bond election, so we'll have discussion on the bond committee process. We'll go through the general obligation bonds, what does voter authorization mean, the constitutional limit, and the debt payment capacity. We're also going to go through the GO bond, or general obligation bond funded capital projects, and recommendations from the bond committee for the election in November. We have draft ballot language to go through, and also we're looking for council consensus on the recommendations from the bond committee. The bond committee was formed back in September of 2019. We have 7 members that are appointed by the council. We have Mr. John Froke as the chair, and Ms. Lisa Baker here as the vice chair. We also have Michael Boulay, John Gears, Mr. Gary Hirsch, Michael Socaccio, and Ryan Westlink on the committee. We've had several meetings and presentations for the committee. All the meetings and presentations are informational. We held 2 meetings in November. The first meeting, we went through the general obligation bond. We had representatives from our financial advisor, RBC Capital Markets, do the presentation. We also covered voter authorization, and our bond attorney, Mr. DeHaan, from Greenberg Traurig, also did a presentation. In December of 2019, we did go through the election process. We had representatives from the city attorney's office and also the city clerk's office assisting with the presentation for that. We went through the capital improvement plan, the 10-year CIP. At that time, it was the adopted fiscal year 2020 CIP. In January of 2020, we also had presentations from departments on their capital improvement plans. We have landfill and flood control do the presentations. February 2020, we continued with the presentations from the departments. Parks and governmental facilities, including public safety, was presented at that time. In June of 2020, we finished up the capital improvement plan presentations from the departments. We did cover libraries, streets, and transit. And at that meeting, the committee drafted the ballot language for council consideration. And with that, I will turn over the presentation to Ms. Rios.
So Mayor, or Vice Mayor, members of the council, just as a refresher, you know a lot of this information, but I thought it would be good to kind of go back for the public and for the record as well, just to give some information about general obligation bonds. So general obligation bonds are paid for using secondary property tax. And right now, the direction of the council has been to keep the property tax levy at a flat amount. And I'll explain in a moment what kind of the impact of that is. General obligation bonds, because they are based on property values, they must be authorized by the voters, and that's why we're here. And there is something called a constitutional limit on general obligation bonds. So that particular limit says that your outstanding debt cannot exceed 20% of your limited property value for projects for water, sewer, public safety, streets, transportation, open space, and parks. In our case, that unused borrowing capacity, meaning we would have to borrow $167.8 million for GO debt for those types of projects in order to hit that 20% limit. No more than 6% of your limited property value can be used for general municipal purposes, which would be things like libraries, general government, facilities, and economic development. And our unused borrowing capacity there is $84.8 million for those types of projects. The next slide is basically showing you currently what our GO bond debt service looks like. You can see right now that we're paying approximately $20 million a year for debt service on general obligation bonds. That continues through 2023 when it drops sharply. The capacity that we have there is roughly, it goes from around 20 million down to around 7. So you have about 13 million that you could issue bonds and pay an additional 13 million in general obligation debt service without raising the property tax. And then you can see there's a little bit of capacity again that opens up in 2031 and 2038. Let me go back just a second to that slide. So when we talk about general obligation bonds, we're talking about, we use different terms to describe them. And so we're here using the term general obligation bond debt service capacity, which means our ability to pay off those bonds. So with a flat levy, our ability to pay off those bonds is to the extent of about $20 million a year. Now, it does grow slightly every year for the value of additional property that is added to the rolls. But again, from the direction of this council, we're not raising the property tax rate. Your capacity would go up if you were to do that, but it's been the direction of this council to keep it flat.
Look, I want to ask you a question. I think it's just the way that this graph is, but you have a light green and a dark green. Is that another level of something that's not listed, or is that just supposed to be the cap?
Mayor, members of the council, thank you for the question. That's the principal versus the interest. So the green section, the total is the total at the top, the 20 million. In that, you're paying, 15 million is principal, and then 20 million is interest. And so every year, the amount of principal and interest varies slightly until the bonds are paid off.
That wasn't my question. Sure, what I'm talking about. That's what sort of like the top of the walls is the.
Oh no, that doesn't represent anything. It's
Okay,
just the.
I just wanted to make sure.
Okay.
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 There's
Sorry.
a different colored green. I was just trying to verify that.
Mayor.
Okay.
Ms. Rios, so in keeping our levy flat, we can afford $20 million a year in payments. What does that relate to as far as the total indebtedness? Is that coming up on a slide?
Mayor, members of the council, no, it is not, because that's a very complicated question to answer. It's not easy to answer. What I can tell you, because of the way bonds are structured, and your ability to structure them in different ways, pay more principal at first, more interest at first, and less principal, and also the number of years that you issue the bonds could be 20 years, 3 years, 25 years. It could be, there's factors like interest rates that impact it. So it's a complicated question. What I can tell you is at this point in time, that $20 million in debt service that we are paying is on $100 million in outstanding bonds.
Thank you.
Okay, When we talk about general obligation bonds, another term that we frequently use is something called voter authorization. And so this chart is telling you right now what is the remaining voter authorization, and the authorization occurs in various different categories. What we went through with the bond committee was basically to say, here is the current authorization for each one of these categories. And in this case, this is how much authority you would need to fund the 5-year CIP. So if you take a look at, for example, at the landfill, we currently have $15,540,000 in authority to issue bonds to pay for landfill. In the 5-year CIP, we have 17 or almost $18 million in projects planned. And so there's a shortfall there of about $2.3 million. So this is all that this chart is really telling you. Oops, go back 1 second. The other large one to look at there is Parks and Recreation. That's another one where we have about $14 million in authorization from the voters right now. And you have in the current 5-year CIP about $55 million worth of projects. And that's just reflecting then the shortfall of about almost 40.1 million in authority.
Mayor? I don't know if this is the right time to ask the question, but in the landfill, we just adjusted our tipping fees not that long ago, at least within the last year. And is this considered in these capital costs and this capital shortfall when we adjust our tipping fees?
Mayor, Councilmember Tomasoff, this doesn't really have anything to do with the landfill and their tipping fees. This is just your authority to issue bonds for the landfill. Now, the landfill is a little bit unique because those bonds could be paid with secondary property tax because they're general obligation bonds. But in this case, most likely you would pay them from the landfill enterprise fund. And so they're a little bit outside of that $20 million in capacity, assuming that you use the landfill enterprise fund. They're typically just borrowed as general obligation bonds because they'll get a lower interest rate, and the landfill doesn't have enough credit on its own to issue those bonds. So in order to get them a better interest rate, you issue them as general obligation bonds, but typically you pay them from the landfill enterprise fund.
Right, okay. So, but I mean, is this all part of the analysis? You don't have to bond for all of it. $2.4 million of that could come out of other revenue from the landfill fund if we had it. You don't have to use only general obligation bonds, do we? I'm just curious if this is a part of the analysis when we adjust tipping fees.
Mayor, members of the council, the landfill enterprise fund has a model in which it shows bond funding for some or all of that cost. So the 17 million reflects what they believe they would want to borrow during that period of time. And their tipping fees are then adjusted and analyzed to incorporate paying that debt service. So
Okay.
yes, it is part of their model, but the assumption is that they would GO bond fund for this portion of it.
Okay, thank Mayor. So the tipping fees are adjusted to handle, I just want to make sure that the Glendale residents aren't assuming all of the capital costs or the debt service, that's still part of what we look at when we adjust the tipping fees, that because we're sharing our landfill, that burden shouldn't just be on Glendale residents, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yes, that's correct. It's
Okay,
incorporated
thank you.
into the analysis of the fees. Okay, so taking a look at that, the next page is the same type of analysis. So the first or the second column there is the same. That's the current GO bond voter authority or voter authorization. But the third column over, well, it's actually the fourth column, shows you how much is in the CIP over the 10-year period. So now you can see, for example, if you were to fund the 10-year CIP for landfill, again, the 10-year CIP just for projects that are eligible to be financed with GO bonds, there's a shortfall for the landfill of now close to $9 million. Or, I'm sorry, close to 10. So what we told the bond committee as part of their process is you can decide that you want to recommend to the council to fund the 5-year CIP. You can decide you can to fund the 10-year CIP, or anywhere in between, or not at all. So their recommendations to you, and Ms. Camacho is going to go through those here in a minute, were they could do anything within the range. And as you'll see, in some cases, the committee is recommending to you to get authority for the entire amount, for the entire 10-year CIP to fund that. In some cases, they're recommending to you that you fund only the 5 years because they felt that there could be another bond election, for example, in the next 5 years. And sometimes somewhere in between. And so it's, I guess, the point being, it's not an all or nothing, and this is their recommendation to you, and we have a couple of them here, again, so that you can ask questions if you want about sort of what was their thinking in making a particular recommendation. Now, ultimately, the decision is up to the council to vote as to what they want to send to the ballot. But we wanted to lay the foundation for you the same way that we did for the bond committee. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ms. Camacho.
The next several slides will cover the recommendations from the bond committee. The first one is the landfill capital projects. And as Ms. Rios went over in the last 2 slides, for the 5-year CIP of landfill, they have projects of about $17.9 million that are eligible for GO bond funding. The 2 projects that comprise of the $17.9 million is the North Cell liner for $7.8 million, the North Cell construction of about $10.2 million. And as Ms. Rio stated earlier, within the 5-year CIP, we need an additional $2.4 million in voter authorization to fund all the projects within the 5-year CIP for the landfill fund. For the 10-year CIP, there are $25.4 million in capital projects. So the way this slide works is that it would include the projects that are listed in the 5-year CIP, the liner and the construction, plus the continuation of the North Cell liner of $3 million, and also continuation of the construction of the North Cell of about $4.4 million. In the previous slide, it did state that if we fund the full 10-year CIP for the landfill fund, there would be an additional $9.9 million in voter authorization that is needed. The next slide is the bond committee recommendation. The committee did recommend for council consideration doing $9.9 million in additional voter authorization in the November election. We've also provided the draft ballot language, and you should have copies of that within your handouts. The first proposition is for landfill capital projects. The language would be planning, acquiring, designing, constructing, extending, and improving landfill facilities. The maximum interest rate would be 8% when we issue the bonds. At this time, as you know, interest rates are very low, but for the ballot language itself, we need to put a max in the language. And the intent is for the landfill fund to pay the debt service on the general obligation bonds that we would issue.
Mayor. Thank you. I've related this landfill capital project slide to the proposition number 1 on landfill with the 9.9 request for additional voter authorization. And I noted that in all the other propositions, there are bullet points that kind of further refine what the funds will be used for, but there's no such construction in Proposition 1, since it seems to relate to the North Cell expansion, opening and expansion. I wondered why we didn't put a bullet in there in proposition number 1, further clarifying that this relates to the Northland, the North Cell opening and expansion. It just, all the others have bullets, and that one does not. And I wondered why, if you could explain that for me.
Mayor and Councilmember Clark, we discussed that, and I, as a citizen, really didn't know what a liner was, and we kind of thought that maybe the voters wouldn't know, and we're going to design, acquire, and construct, and I don't know if they really needed to, we didn't think they really needed to know the details as to exactly what.
And I don't think I was even asking for the details, but rather a bullet point that said something along the lines of this relates to the opening and expansion of the north cell of the landfill, which in
Mayor?
one sentence says basically what that entire paragraph says.
Mayor, members of the council, if there is council consensus to do that, we would certainly be able to add additional detail.
Well, I would ask council to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So I see the Public Works Operating Center. I don't remember that actually. I mean, has that been finalized? And what's that dollar amount that would be necessary? I don't see it. It's part of the ballot language, just specifically part of the ballot language.
Mayor, members of the council, I'm sorry, Councilmember Tomatov, in which ballot are you talking about?
I'm looking at.
For the landfill?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my paper and I'm not on the right page. Never mind.
I was just trying to figure out where you're at. Okay.
I don't have that page. That's my top page. Okay, thank you.
Mayor, members of the council, at this point, we are looking for council consensus on whether we could move forward with the proposed dollar amount, the 9.9 million as recommended by the bond committee, and also the proposed ballot language.
Mayor, then I would ask that we consider putting a bullet in further specifying that this relates to activities related to the north
Well,
cell.
let's do that one first. Do we have a consensus on Councilmember
Mayor,
Clark's?
does anybody have the landfill ballot language?
Yes,
Yes.
proposition number 1.
Exhibit A.
If I might, Councilmember Tomatov, these may be printed double-sided. Is it on the back side of one of your pages?
I don't have the landfill on.
I'm sure we can find another copy of it.
So again, my question, do we have consensus on
Okay,
Councilmember Clark's idea with that verbiage?
thank you.
Just for clarification.
That's fine.
Oh, there it is. All right,
Sorry?
I found it, thank you.
Mayor, what
No.
specific language?
Oh, yes, slow down for a second. I'm just asking, well, I've got 3 people right now, but nobody else, well, actually, I got 4. I do have a consensus. Go ahead. Okay,
What is the specific language you'd like to have?
Councilmember Clark.
I will leave it up to you, but the general thought is a simple bullet point that says that the activities above relate to the opening and expansion of the north landfill. North cell at the landfill. You can word it any way you want to, but just that general concept.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor,
Go ahead.
if I'm following what Councilmember Clark is suggesting, it's about format, so that the format is consistent from question to question.
Correct.
And without studying all of them yet, I look at the next one, and the first bullet point is planning, and the second one starts with furnishing. And I see that in this language that we have, on line number 4 begins with planning, so that might be that bullet point. You know, so that it's projects, including but not limited to planning, acquiring, designing, and constructing, which is the same format it looked like we used on the next one.
That would be fine.
And And you wanted to add something about, specifically about the north cell or more about the liner?
No, north-south. Let's not get into the weeds, just the north-south. That these activities are related to the north-south.
Mayor, members of the council, Mr. DeHaan is here, and he'll know exactly where to put it in, and we'll get it revised for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now your question.
Now we're moving on to the Parks and Recreation capital projects. Similar to the landfill slide, we have the 5-year CIP at 55.1
Slow down.
million.
I think we need to back up because I don't think we asked or answered your question. You were looking for consensus on the 9, correct?
Yes.
Mayor, members of the council, yes, that is correct.
Okay, so go ahead and rephrase that, and then we'll do that one next.
Mayor, members of the council, do we have consensus on the ballot language as amended by Councilmember Clark to add clarification language on the north cell construction and also the additional voter authorization of $9.9 million?
Okay, the first part we do. The second part, I'm asking for consensus on that.
Mayor?
Yes.
9.9, go ahead.
As I see it, the committee is recommending that we ask for authorization so that we can fund 100% of our 10-year CIP for the landfill, and that seems pretty smart to me, so I'm going to agree.
Still waiting for consensus.
Yes.
Okay, very good. You got it. Thank you.
Moving on to the Parks and Recreation capital projects. The 5-year CIP has $55.1 million in capital projects. It includes the list of projects you see on the slide. If the 5-year CIP is funded, we would need an additional $40.8 million in additional voter authorization. For the 10-year CIP, there would be $101.5 million in capital projects. It does include the build-out for the Heroes Park Regional Park. That's $46.4 million. And we would need an additional $87.2 million in voter authorization. The recommendation from the bond committee is to fund the full 10-year CIP for Parks and Recreation capital projects. The additional voter authorization that is needed is $87.2 million. The draft ballot language is proposition number 2, and it states planning, constructing, adding to, and renovating existing parks and recreation facilities within the city. I do want to add that as part of the discussion by the bond committee, they did not add language for new parks. And the next bullet item would be furnishing and equipping parks and recreation facilities within the city, including lighting, irrigation, structures, and restrooms. Similar to the landfill ballot language, the maximum interest rate would be 8% when we issue the bonds. And with that, we'll open it up for council discussion and questions. And for this item, we are also looking for a consensus from the council on the additional voter authorization amount and the ballot language.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. It's funny, I had circled, and I don't know if you meant to do this, but under bullet number 1, proposition number 2, my version says planning, constructing, adding to, and removing existing parks, at which point my blood pressure went up 10 points. But you're saying that it should not be removing, it should be renovating? So that's my first question. Please clarify.
Mayor, members of the council, you are correct. It should be renovating, and I see that the draft ordinance does state removing. It should be renovating.
Okay, that calms me down considerably. I think I interpreted adding to existing parks and recreation facilities within the city meant that new parks or new park facilities could be created. You're saying that that does not imply that within this proposition?
Mayor, members of the council, yes, you are correct. We would not be able to add new parks with this ballot proposition.
Well, my concern is as we move westward, at some point, we're going to be compelled. It might be 10 years from now, it might be 5 years from now, it might be 15 years from now. But at some point, we will be compelled to add some kind of park amenity out west. Granted, it's predominantly industrial, but as we note with Allen Ranches, that has a residential component, and we cannot foresee in the future what other new development projects will also include a residential component. So I think to cover ourselves, we should have language in here that specifically relates to adding new parks. I don't care if we say out west or along the Loop 303 or whatever, but
Mayor?
we can't foretell the future, and we can't foretell all of the future needs, but I think we need to cover all of our bases.
Vice Mayor.
I think the Councilmember Tomachoff was first, but I'll go ahead.
All right, thank you. I feel like we should say improving instead of adding to, because that might be a little bit confusing on the ballot language, that there's anticipation of additional parks. And with this amount of money, I mean, 87 million sounds like a lot of money, but once we start, I want to make sure I understand, the 87 million is needed also, 46 million of that is going to go to Heroes Park, right? Is that?
Mayor, members of the council, if I may. Heroes Park is an example of one of the projects, and it is one of the projects that the bond committee specifically wanted to get enough authority for that $46.4 million. But it doesn't, in that case, specifically guarantee that it will build out Heroes Park. It just gives you enough authority within that time frame to do all of these projects.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Mayor, if I could continue then. But my point is then that the build-out of Heroes Park is going to use up more than half of the capacity that we're going to have for that $87.2 million. So I don't know, this is for 10 years. I don't believe we're going to need, because Allen Ranch is going to have parks within their HOA that are going to be not our responsibility. Stonehaven is going to have parks within the community. They're not our responsibility. I know everybody says, you know, there's a lot more parks in the north, but a lot of them are HOA responsibility, and that's a great thing for the city, because we still get the parks, but we don't have the O&M. I think for 10 years, we're not going to have to worry about it. And in 10 years, with everything that's happening out there, we'll probably have enough, maybe in diff fees and things, to do another park. So I don't think, in my opinion anyway, is we're going to have a tall task already to do what we want to do with this amount of money, and including another park in this bonding. I don't feel like it would be wise, because, like I said, and I support Heroes Park, Joyce, but that's going to eat up about half of this money, and then the rest of the money, the little over $40 million, is going to have to go a long way. Taking another bite out of this with another new park that we don't need right now. And we probably will be able to satisfy that with diff fees at some point down the road. I think that might be a better way to go. Thank you.
Mayor, I have no problem with your rationalization. I just wanted to protect ourselves in case, you know, it comes down the road that all of a sudden we're literally compelled or forced to provide an amenity that we hadn't planned for.
Mayor, members of the council, I'm sorry, Mayor, did you have something?
I think Mr. Milner had.
Oh,
Well, I just, my thoughts were along that same line, that we don't know the future, and that council will need to make a decision. If we need a new park, this project is not for new parks, and I don't think we should think about putting it into new park, but we should just leave it for the redevelopment of some of our existing parks. And then if we need a new park, we discuss that at a later date.
And I'll add to that. I agree with what you said, although we're over 20 years with Heroes Park, and it really would be nice to finish that promise made long time ago. And I think all of us realize, 10 years goes by really fast, really fast.
Mayor, I was just gonna reiterate that, yes, there are other funding sources. This is just one funding source, and you will have other funding sources potentially available for new parks.
Okay, so I was going to say, yes, there's other funding sources. The authorized bonds that already exist, are they restricted to new parks as well? Or are they open for, or I mean, are they restricted from being used on new parks? Or could they, should the need arise, use some of that authorization?
Mayor, members of the council, yes, the other, the current, or the last ballot language that gave authority to parks included the words for new parks.
New parks, okay.
Correct.
So we're mirroring what they approved 10 years ago as well? No, it included new parks. This is only for existing parks. Gotcha, that's what I was hoping. That's the answer I was looking for. Thank you. The language seems a little cumbersome to me because I'm not clear in reading this as to whether or not it's existing recreation facilities as well. And we have some new facilities planned, for instance, at Heroes that don't currently exist. I mean, the park, the acreage exists, but says adding to and renovating existing parks and recreation facilities. So that mean we can only renovate existing recreation facilities?
Mr. DeHaan, do you want to answer that question? Do you?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, my name is Bill DeHaan. I'm a shareholder with the law firm of Greenberg Traurig. We're the city's bond counsel. It was my recollection from what the committee directed was that you would not have the ability to do that unless you specifically said that's what you wanted to do. So you would be limited, as written, to existing facilities.
So Mayor, if I may, so we don't currently have an aquatics facility at Heroes Park. Could we use this money to put one in?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I believe you could. It's an existing park, an improvement to an existing park. So on that basis, I would agree with that.
And to clarify, the park, actually, the park itself is the boundaries of the acreage, even though it's not being utilized for ball fields and things like that. It's that location, correct?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, that's
Okay.
correct.
Well, it concerns me it took him too long to answer that question. He had to think it over pretty hard. I wonder what that means for future bond counsel or the voters at the polls. I don't know if there's maybe I'm the only one bothered with it. It just doesn't seem clear to me that it's for future facilities inside existing parks.
Mayor,
Go ahead.
if I may, then to be clear, why not just add for future facilities in existing parks? And that satisfies your concern. I wouldn't have a problem with it.
So if you're going to say that, why not add one more word to it, park boundaries?
To existing park boundaries, okay.
I think it really clarifies it then.
Mayor, members of the council, if I understand the question, I just want to make sure. What the concern is that you could, under this language, it would appear that you can add to or renovate an existing park, but not build a new recreation facility? Am I capturing that correctly?
That's my concern.
Even though it's within an existing park?
Right. And as I read it too, when it says adding to existing parks, does that mean we could buy acreage adjacent to an existing park and make it larger? Was that the committee's interest? I don't know that we have that plan.
Mayor, members of the council, I think you have to read the entire sentence, and I think it does say what the council is, so it's talking about adding to and renovating existing parks and recreation facilities. So you have adding to, and you have renovation of both parks and recreational facilities. So that's, you have to read the "and" recreation facilities within the city. But it says existing parks. So that would limit you. You wouldn't be able to add a new park somewhere else. It's existing parks.
Right. Mr. Phelps, and I think, at least my point is, Heroes Park, you go out there, there's a lot of just fields. And some people might argue, is that actually a park, or is that just a field next to the park? And so my thought, if we put park boundaries, seem like it really clarifies it without any doubt to anybody, I would think.
Mr. Mayor, I would concur.
Mr. DeHaan, do you have enough to capture that, do you think?
Actually, Mayor, if I may ask a question, just to clarify for drafting purposes. So would the notion be that you'd be renovating existing parks and facilities within existing boundaries? Is that how we would
Park
modify
boundaries,
that?
yeah.
Okay.
Only.
That, I think that it addresses Councilmember Turner's about buying additional land next to the park. Heroes Park, again, there's a lot of vacant land that some person might show up and go, well, that's just a field next to the park. And so just really nail it down. I mean, that is a park, it's just not being utilized as a park right now in certain areas.
Mayor,
Go ahead.
what is it that we're, if I may, what is it that are we trying to prevent new parks? I'm trying to understand, just to make sure we're really clear, because we say something and then we explain it, and the more we explain it, the less I understand it.
Mayor,
Mr. Bailey, if I could,
Actually, Ms. Rios, if you'd allow the council to explain it, I'd appreciate that.
I'll just, okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
Mayor, if I might.
Go ahead.
I believe the intent of this council is to direct this authorization to the improvements of existing parks and not the development of new parks. And I believe the mayor's suggestion with regard to improvement within existing park boundaries was an attempt to further clarify and remove the possibility of adding additional land to an existing park.
Mayor? If she's finished, I'm sorry.
No, I'm done. I'm done.
Thank you, Mayor. I feel like the word "adding to" is, my opinion anyway, is what the problem here. It doesn't say improving, and that's what this whole thing is about, is improving the parks. So, and adding to, I believe, may cause confusion even for the voters. So if it just said planning, constructing, improving, and renovating existing parks within whatever the language that, I'm fine with it, clarifying the boundaries and recreation facilities within the city, I feel like that would probably be something that not only would be easier to understand, but more appealing to voters, in my opinion.
And Mr. Bailey, to your question, I just don't want the voters to be confused and vote against something or vote for something if they're confused. I want them to have it accurately.
And Mayor and Council, that's what I'm trying to make sure as well. So my understanding would be that you will not, or these fundings will not be used to acquire new parkland or to create new parks.
Correct.
That's my understanding, yes.
I just want to be clear on that.
Mayor,
Who's asking that?
right over here, mask. You just can't see my lips moving. Mayor. Ventriloquist. We can really confuse this. So I first of all, want to say to the committee, the members, thank you so much for all the time and effort you put into this. But he did a really good job, by the way. So we can really confuse it because renovation and remodeling is different. If you just say renovation, we can't change the function of a facility. So just put another wrench in there. Do we need to change that from renovation / remodeling? And I think Ms. Watanko, if she's here, she'll tell you there's a complete difference there if you really want to be transparent. And I agree with Councilmember Tomanchov, improving would probably be a better word, but renovating is improving, so it can get really confusing here.
You're the attorney.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, so based on what I've heard, the first bullet point would be revised to read planning, constructing, improving, and remodeling existing parks and recreation facilities within existing park boundaries.
Can somebody explain to me what the difference between renovating and remodeling is? Because I'm not sure I understand. I don't think remodeling covers everything that we might want to do as far as renovating basketball courts. That's not really a remodel. In my opinion, anyway, that's a renovation. So I would want to understand what the difference is before I could be in agreement with that, because I think some of this stuff is going to be renovation.
Mayor, if I may try to answer that, I can. Councilmember Tomachoff, renovation would be refreshing a facility to include and not change its current function. A remodel would be to change a building's function from, let's say, a community center to a kitchen, if you will. So two different things. So.
Mayor, if I could, but we're not talking about just buildings, we're talking about outdoor basketball courts.
That would be the same.
And volleyball courts and playground equipment and that sort of thing, where I don't know necessarily whether, painting or I just don't know whether that's really remodeling.
The same would
If you're
apply.
not changing anything, you're just renovating an existing piece of equipment, putting down a new surface on a basketball court. I don't know that that's a remodel, so.
Mayor,
Mayor?
Mayor.
Mayor, if I may.
Go ahead.
For the council, one element to consider is that this is for the authorization. So there's an element of this that you may want to contemplate the authorization to be broader than more restrictive. And because recognizing that this is just the authorization. So the public would have the opportunity that when the time came for the improvement to actually be approved, they would then be able to come before the council as well. So the more restrictive you become in this language, the more restrictive you are in what you're able to do long-term. I think one of the challenges is that it speaks to planning, constructing, and it's the concept of adding to. And I'm not sure what the adding to means. If the general language is planning and constructing of amenities for existing parks and recreation facilities within the city, because that's what I'm hearing. But there's also an element that we're also trying to overly define things here, which we may not really need to go through that exercise at this time.
Mayor?
And I was thinking updates, kind of an easy way to do that too. Go ahead.
Again, we got to realize, we're on the discussion because we're thinking of what the public is going to read when they get out there and look at that. We want it to be as crystal clear to them as what we're doing. And I know broad is better if it gives us more authority, but for the public, they want less broad. They want to know exactly what we're doing, what the money's going to be used for. So to answer all these questions, all we have to do is add one more word: constructing, improving, or remodeling. I think that states everything we want to do with these funds.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I certainly can, again, and thank you to the committee. I can now appreciate how difficult you've had getting to this point. Certainly, improving instead of adding to, I think is better, because it takes away the idea of geographically making a park bigger. So I don't think we need to have the park boundary concept. We can say both renovating and remodeling existing parks. I'm back to my initial struggle, though, is it says existing parks and recreation facilities within the city. And every time it's been read as da-da-da-da-da-da to existing park and recreation facilities. So it doesn't tell me that we have money for new recreation facilities. We could remodel Rose Lane Park, renovate it, improve it, but we couldn't add a new facility there. And that concerns me, especially if we're talking about Heroes Park. We have lots of facilities that we plan on adding there, and this says that we can't use this money for that in my read.
May I? Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I interpret constructing and improving existing parks to mean you can build new things on existing parks, but we can be as explicit as you like.
I'm just one of seven.
Guess the question is, does it pass the headline test? Mr. Bailey, if it does, then let's move on.
Mayor and council, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer the headline test, but I think we have some direction and we can work on that to try and clarify it. Because we're focused on one section of this and there's more contained in this that impacts it. Because if you actually read further on, it speaks to the fact that you're getting the authorization to acquire property. And that's kind of in the lower half of that. So we'll probably sit down with Mr. DeHaan, and that's why the discussion was helpful. I think I have a better idea of where you want to get on this, and so we can over-lawyer it and make it really simple.
Do what you guys do best.
Just as long as you save Heroes Park.
All right, so
Mayor?
what else do you need from us right now?
Mayor, members of the council, first of all, do we have a consensus on the dollar amount, 87.2 million, for additional voter authorization?
Yes, we do.
The second item is a consensus on the direction by the council to simplify the ballot language, and Mr. Bailey and our bond attorney, Mr. DeHaan, will draft a language for council
I
consideration.
don't know if I like the word simplify, but clarify, I think, might be a better word.
Clarify.
Okay, I believe that you do on that question.
Yeah, Mayor, well, I just wanted to make a suggestion. I wanted to know, did we decide on renovating and remodeling? We were gonna, I think that's kind of where we ended up, whatever the attorneys say. But maybe it could just say completing, because the Heroes Park's in our CIP. So if it says something about completing, that might cover it too. Is that would cover, completing plans that are already exist in, we can add new plans to existing parks, but that's already planned. So I agree, I don't want to cause a problem for Heroes Park, but I honestly don't think this will, but we'll let the attorneys figure that part out. But I want to make sure that we are able to complete it
Mayor?
as promised.
I bow to the attorneys. They do have their direction and bond counsel, and they know that whatever language they create must preserve the concept of Heroes Park completion. So I leave it up to them to craft the language.
Okay, so is there a consensus on that with the attorneys fully understanding what we want?
Yes.
Is that?
Yes.
Okay. What else you got?
The next slide is on the flood control capital projects. Within the 5-year CIP, we have 14.1 million in capital projects. The projects are listed below in the slide. If we fund a 5-year CIP, we would need an additional 4.4 million in voter authorization. The 10-year CIP is approximately 19 million. And if the 10-year CIP is funded, we would need an additional 9.3 million in voter authorization.
Mayor? I just have one question. Was the committee presented with the concept that these were the most critical drainage projects that needed to be accomplished within the city?
Mayor, members of the council, yes, that is correct.
Then, okay, thank you. That's all I need to know.
The bond committee recommendation is 9.3 million in additional voter authorization, which would fund the 10-year CIP. The draft ballot language is planning, constructing, equipping, acquiring, and installing flood control facilities, which may include joint facilities to be used with others. Improvements to storm water lines and drains, flood control channels, and detention and retention basins. Similar to the other propositions, the maximum interest rate is 8%. And I believe this is proposition number 4, but let me verify. it is proposition number 4, and with that, I'll open it up for council discussion and questions.
I don't see anybody holding their hand up. We have to take care of 3 or 4 of those areas that flood. Anybody driven down those roads when we're getting a lot of rain, it's bad. So I'm in full support of this one. Okay, we have a consensus? Yes.
Okay, consensus on the dollar amount of $9.3 million and the draft ballot language.
Yes.
The next slides are on the street capital projects, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Jack Friedline.
Thank you, Ms. Camacho. Mayor, City Council, I'll be discussing the next 4 or 5 slides with reference to our streets capital programs that deal specifically with arterial reconstructions. On the slide that you see before you, we take you back with reference to what an arterial is. We have over 101 miles of arterials. We have what we call an ARP, Arterial Reconstruction Program. As a reminder, our arterials are really the framework with reference to the Valley's 1-mile grid system, both north, south, and both east-west. Arterials are the most traveled streets of any city street system. They're typically the widest with the most utilities above and below, with intersections usually being very unique and complex, may have dual left turn lanes, may have dedicated right turn lanes, may have medians with landscaping and traffic signage, just to name a few. Due to the complexity and the time we really want to reconstruct that street is every 30 years. In the interim, we'll maintain the street. We'll do things we need to do, whether it's seal coating or crack seal, even mill and overlay or slurries. With the math of 100 plus miles of arterials and striving for a 30-year cycle, it obviously it tells you that we need a little bit more than 3 miles of street to reconstruct every year on the average. And with the idea that today's estimate is $3.2 million to reconstruct an arterial street, and that is without other utilities such as sewer and water. And even today we have estimates of the more complicated street sections closer to 3.5 million, that we would, if we were to do 3 miles per year, it would add up to approximately $10 million per year in today's dollars, just to keep up with our arterial streets. On the next slide, that's slide 17, within the Streets Capital Program, you will see just about 10 miles, 9.5 miles of reconstructions that are currently funded and in your CIP book. And as of note, and as Ms. Rios reminded myself and the bond committee, we spoke with reference to the funding of those 10 miles as 10 million plus or minus in GO bonds and 15 million dedicated through the GO sales tax, of which we will be back to City Council at the workshop on June 23rd, talking about the ability to use existing voter-authorized bonds instead of the $15 million in sales tax, which is cash, to allow us to show you an enhanced pavement management program that takes us out through years 6 through 10. But that's for another day. We just wanted to mention that because we had a very healthy discussion with the bond committee with reference to that. We also have an additional 8 miles of arterial streets that would add up to approximately $30 million, also in the 1 to 5 year CIP. Specifically, it really starts at year 2. That was not in the CIP. It was part of our arterial reconstruction program, but because there was no funding for it, whether it was GO bonds or cash, staff decided to wait for the opportunity to be able to go before a bond committee with reference to considering future bond sales through a referendum. And that's what we have today. And staff was, and I don't know that anybody knew for sure if the bond committee was going to look at this from a 5-year perspective or a 10 years perspective. So we added the need with reference to $10 million a year for the 5-year period between years 6 through 10, which would add up to another $50 million of need. The next slide reflects, this says a 10-year program. These are the projects that are in our, that are in your CIP book published, and they reflect actually the first 5 years, because the second 5 years, we had no arterials identified in that, and again, that's because we didn't have any funding for it. These are ones I presume that you're fairly familiar with, and as of note, you'll see in the columns in the middle, GO bond funding, approximately $14.7 million, and then the transportation sales tax, a little over $15 million. On the next slide, we show you the almost 8 miles, 7.9 miles of arterials that we presented to the bond committee as needed arterials to be reconstructed between years 2 and 5. And again, these are close to 1-year segments, and depending on the complications with reference to these, there's a variance in the cost. The total cost, though, is very close, as you'll see, to $30 million. On the next slide, and again, we had a very good, robust conversation with the bond committee. They considered the $30 million that we requested for years 2 through 5 and the new projects we showed. They also considered the $50 million for the out years at $10 million a year, years 6 through 10. That would add up to $80 million. And they thought they should adjust it somewhat for inflation, and they added $1.5 million to that. And they came to an $81.5 million recommendation on voter authorization. The ballot language was similar to the old streets and parking bond referendum, with the exception of removing parking from it. I think, and the bond committee members can speak to it, but I think they like the consistency of continuing to do street arterials over the years, and therefore, it was easier to take a look at this from a 10-year perspective rather than a 5. They talked about things not changing. We need to continue to do this. From time to time, the street sections may change, but consistently, it would be an arterial reconstruction program. So with that, I would ask that the council get to the discussion and question section. I'm available for any questions.
Vice Mayor.
Questions? Councilmember Clark.
Yes, I concur with the committee's request, and they specifically recommended removing reference to parking. Then why do we call proposition number 3 streets and parking?
Mayor, members of the council, we need to correct that. It should just say streets. I was going to mention something about that here shortly, but
Okay.
thank you.
Thank
That was
you.
the recommendation of the committee, was to remove reference to parking, and the ballot language down below doesn't reference parking, but the title wasn't corrected.
Yeah, I read the ballot language and couldn't find anything about parking, so thank you for that correction, and I'm comfortable.
Any other questions? Councilmember Palmachado.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So the 10 million in GO bonds on slide 17, is that the $10 million that was reallocated to parks? Is that moving back to streets, or I just want to make sure I understand?
Mayor, members of the council, that's the amount of GO bonds that are already planned in the current CIP. So some of those bonds have already been sold, where we have some bond proceeds on hand in the form of cash to use for some street reconstruction. Did I answer your question?
Well, I just want to make sure. So does this plan, does this plan including moving that money back over to streets because we're going to be bonding for the $87.1 million in parks?
Mayor, members of the council, if I understand your question, I think you're referring to the 15 million. So the 10 million is already in the CIP. And as I said, there were already bonds issued for about 10 million. The 15 million right now wasn't on the council priority. So when we last did GO bond prioritization, we didn't prioritize that 15 million, even though we have the authority. Again, this is where we kind of have to be careful with our terms. Even though we have voter authority to issue another 15 million, right now we don't have that in the CIP showing that 15 million as being funded by GO bonds. We show it as being funded by transportation sales tax, which is cash. And what Mr. Friedline is saying essentially is, if you shift that 15 million back to being funded by GO bonds, it will free up $15 million in cash out of transportation sales tax, which you can then use for pavement management.
Okay.
Now, to do that, under the understanding, and keep the property tax levy flat, we've determined, and I think council knows, that we can issue in the next, 3 to 5 years, about 175 million in new GO bonds. We would have to incorporate or absorb that 15 million back into that schedule that we've shown you, where there's about $175 million worth of projects. So it's a trade-off. If you want to shift the 15 million in street projects back to GO bond funding, something else that's currently shown as GO bond funding will have to have another funding source or something of that nature.
Vice Mayor.
Yet to be identified, Vice Mayor?
Oh, go ahead, Councilwoman Tomcha.
So what was going to be funded, that would need yet to be identified, where the money would be coming from?
Mayor, member of the council, that's correct. What we would do, and again, today what we're talking about is voter authority.
Okay.
So assuming that this is, the direction that the city goes, and we obtain this $81.5 million $81.5 million worth of authority, each time we do the CIP, council is basically then approving in the plan what the funding sources for those projects will be. And so as we go through the prioritization, again, we'll have to say, well, okay, if we want to prioritize $15 million in street, what do we want to sort of take out of here? Balancing back to that figure of about $175 million over the current 5-year plan. On the longer run, there'll be, as I showed earlier on the graph, there'll be additional bonds paying off and other funding sources and things happening as we go forward. But that would be up to the council. And then in addition to that, every time we actually go to issue bonds, that's another decision of the council to decide these are the bonds we're going to issue in this dollar amount, and we list the projects that would be funded by those bonds. So hopefully I answered your question, but there are a number of other times, I guess, that this comes back to the council before we actually spend or issue those bonds.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that clears it up for me. I was a little bit confused. And I mean, I think this is, at least for myself anyway, a very high priority. We made this commitment 5 years ago, I think, maybe longer than that ago, that we were going to do this. And then once we finish, we're going to have to start over on maintenance. So, I mean, we've got to have an ongoing funding source. And I think most of us hear the most from our residents. At least one of the top 2 or 3 things is this condition of our street. So I'm fine with this.
Councilmember Clark.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. And just to make sure I clarify my understanding, all of this is dependent upon voter approval of voter authorization, which does not occur until November. So any new decision-making would be reflected when we go into the budget cycle for the upcoming fiscal year. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear that just because we say so now, that does not immediately set the dominoes in motion until the voters have approved the actual propositions. So we do have time to consider if we're going to use the 15 million for streets from the debt capacity, what could be shifted further back to supplant that 15 million? Or to take in place of, what I mean.
Vice Mayor, members of the council, that's correct. There's a couple of more times before we would actually
Yeah,
issue that bond.
exactly.
That council looks at it.
Councilmember Turner.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Correct me if I'm wrong, if we follow the bond committee's recommendation, we will be able to have the option in the future of deciding whether to use the $15 million, keeping it, using cash to do that, or freeing up the cash and using bond money to do it. We'll have that authorization if the voters approve it.
Mayor, members of the council, even if the voters don't approve this particular referendum, you have that ability. That 15 million in authority already exists. Voters already approved that. So you can use that authority to build streets according to the ballot language that was in place. So this is an additional $81.5 million that would give you beyond the 15 million.
Okay. Mayor, Vice Mayor, if I can continue then, the 15 in cash that we're talking about, so that's on the table for the future. Well, which way do we want to pay for these projects? Do we want to use that cash, or do we want to use bond money? And it seems to me that the arterial reconstruction program, that's different than our street maintenance program that our 5-year plan. And reconstructing these arterials then gives you a 30-year lifespan for that street. So that's hugely appropriate for using bond money for. And then the pavement management program that we have going on, that's something that needs to be done to a street every 7 to 10 years. So utilizing a 30-year bond to do a 7-year fix doesn't seem quite as good to me. And so that, to be clear, that's not what the bond committee or staff is suggesting. But as far as the cash portion, we might look at that as a way to free up money to be used in our street maintenance program and help us be better on target for our goal there. So I can support the committee's recommendation.
Mayor, do we have consensus on the dollar amount, the 81.5 million for additional voter authorization for streets?
Like you do, yes.
Mayor?
Go ahead.
I would like to bring up another question, I think now, since it was mentioned here several times. Whenever we go out for a bond, the public assumes that their property taxes are going to go up. And that may be the assumption here. And so I'd like you to have a discussion. We talked earlier on the assumption of a flat levy. And I know we've talked about this many times, that this is our policy, but I want you to tell the public what that means regarding all of these bonds.
Mayor, members of the council, so when we do a bond election like this, there are certain disclosures that we'll have to make. And in fact, we will have to make a disclosure as part of the ballot that says, if you issued all of these bonds at 8% right now, what kind of impact would that have on your debt service payments? And so that language will be there. However, our models show us a way to, and it could impact people's property taxes if we were to do that. But the reality of it is, we can't issue all of these bonds at once anyway. We won't be able to construct all of the roads at once. It's a 10-year plan, and we have a way that we've modeled to do at least 175 million, as we know, in projects over the next, again, 3 to 5, 6, however long it takes, years, without raising the property tax at all. So that's our concept, and that's been this council's direction to us, is to keep the levy flat except for the value of new properties being added, and then find a way to finance what we can using the existing capacity to pay the debt service. So that's what we mean by that, is we can issue the bonds and have the timing and the paying off of the bonds be such that we don't have to raise property taxes.
Mayor, if I may, now that we know that, how do we communicate that to the public during this election cycle?
So, Mayor, members of the council, towards the end of the presentation, we are going to talk a little bit about public outreach. We're going to be getting back with the committee to start the process of planning for public outreach. And again, there's certain things that we have to say, and as staff, we're not able to express an opinion about whether voters should vote yes or no for these referendums, but it is our job to provide that information. So what we'll do as part of that public outreach is provide explanation, information that explains how you can do it without raising the property tax, and show those models and kind of how we've modeled it. So that would be our plan, and we would be communicating that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's critical for the success of these bonds that the public understand that there will not be a tax increase on their properties due to these bonds. That will use existing authority to keep the levies at the same rate. Thank you.
Mayor, members of the council, as far as the ballot language, we're also looking for a consensus on that. We've removed the reference to parking, and we'll amend the draft resolution to update the title to only say streets. Do we have a consensus on the ballot language?
Yes.
The next slide is on the library capital projects. With the 5-year CIP, it would fund 15.3 million of capital projects. If we fund the 5-year CIP, there is no need for additional voter authorization. The 10-year CIP is approximately 24.3 million. If the 10-year CIP is funded, then there would be a need for 7.2 million in additional voter authorization. The bond committee recommendation is no additional voter authorization is needed. They felt that we could go back out to the voters in the next 5 years or so. And if you look back at this slide, on slide 21, there is capacity for, let me go back to this slide right here. For library, funding the 5-year CIP of the 15.3 million, you see that there's a balance of about 1.8 million in voter authorization. So going back to that slide, you would be able to continue funding for the main library of about 2 million within the 10-year CIP with no additional voter authorization. And with that, I'll open it up for council discussion and questions.
Good.
Just for clarification, I assumed that when the time comes, the expansion of the Heroes Park Library would go into the Parks and Recreation, go within those bond projects or bond capacity. So I just want to be clear that we don't have to add expansion of Heroes Park Library within library capital projects. I just want to be clear that it's someplace. It may not be in this category, but it certainly would be covered under the Parks and Recreation category. Question mark. Can someone clarify?
I think we're going to have to ask Mr. DeHaan that question. Did you hear the question?
Where would Heroes Park Library expansion go? Would it go under library capital projects or under the Parks and Recreation capital projects?
The Heroes Park expansion, so would the facility itself be a
Yes, the
library?
facility is undersized. It was originally built at 7,500 square feet and is already outgrowing that capacity. So at some point, it will have to be expanded.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I believe that if that facility itself is presented as a library, then the library would be the appropriate, it would be, for lack of a better term, an island within a park that would have to, be funded from library.
Mayor, members of the council, if I could answer the second part of the question. So again, these are sample, these are projects that are currently in the CIP to be funded with existing authority. You can switch out the projects here, so that you could use the existing authority in library bonds to build the expansion of the Heroes Park Library because it's already authorized. It's just a matter of you'd have to switch out some of these projects as you plan your next round of CIP.
So you just want us to fight about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So it's my understanding, and this might be a way to resolve this, is that the issue with the space at Heroes Park Library is there's not enough community space. And the community space can be provided in the community center part of the building, the frac-type facility, if you will, with an aquatic center and everything at Heroes Park, which is on the park side. And I believe that's part of the master plan, or that's what the 46 million that's included in the 46 million for Heroes Park. So am I wrong
I'm fine
there?
with that, Mayor, if I might. I'm fine with that, just as long as I know it's somewhere.
So
I don't
that
care
you'll
where it
still be able
is.
to provide the community space, but we don't have to try to bond for more libraries or fight over it. But, I mean, if you're going to get the community space, I think hopefully that resolves the needs in that part of the city, and we have that already in. Am I right that the 46 million, I mean, I know it's not a definite plan, but that the 46 million, 46.4, I think it is, for Heroes Park includes a community center? Who knows the answer to that?
Mayor, members of the council, that's my understanding. It's a very large number. That is an estimate of what it would take to build that type of facility.
All right.
That's fine. I
Okay.
just was looking for reassurance that it was somewhere.
I support that, Councilmember Clark.
Okay, so you're looking for a consensus on additional voter authorization not needed?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Mayor, I have a question for Mr. Gears, if I could. On these other issues, the committee's recommendation was basically to ask for the authorization that would allow us to complete the 10-year CIP plan in each of these various categories. But the recommendation is different here. Can you share why they didn't feel it was necessary to go for 10-year authorization?
Yes, Mr. Mayor and Councilman Turner, we had some discussion on libraries. Because of the way things are going in the future, you don't need a large library with a lot of books anymore. So we were talking about that, and we're talking about, do we want to get authority for a large amount of money that we won't use? And then it sits there and it's unused. So we looked at what the projects they wanted to do, and it appeared to be enough money already to do those projects. The other one was just a foothills renovation, and we kind of didn't think that was necessary.
Okay. Thank you, sir, and thank you for serving on the committee, too.
It
all of
was
you.
fun. It was a nice, long meeting.
COVID and all.
Moving on.
The next item is the government facilities capital projects. The 5-year CIP funds about $20.5 million in capital projects. There's no additional voter authorization needed to fund a 5-year CIP. There is a balance of $3.3 million in additional voter authorization. For the 10-year CIP, it would fund $45.5 million in capital projects, and we would need an additional $21.8 million in additional voter authorization. The bond committee recommendation is no additional voter authorization is needed, and with that, I'll open it up for council discussion and questions.
Questions from the council? Going once. Anybody?
Mayor? Is there money authorized in excess of what the 5-year CIP would need? Would there, in essence, be some carryover for years 6 through 10?
Mayor, members of the council, there would be additional voter authorization that's not planned of about $3.3 million.
Done?
That was my only question.
What's that?
Yes, that was my question. Thank you.
Mayor, members of the council, do we have a consensus to not have an additional voter authorization for government facilities capital projects?
Yes.
The next slide is on public safety capital projects. The 5-year CIP would fund $61.5 million in capital projects, and the projects are listed on this slide. There is no additional voter authorization needed. With funding the 5-year CIP, there would be a balance of about $36.6 million in voter authorization. The 10-year CIP would fund approximately $122 million in capital projects. It would also include the following projects that are listed on this slide. If the 10-year CIP is funded, there would be a need of $24 million in additional voter authorization. The bond committee recommendation is no additional voter authorization is needed at this time. And with that, I'll open it up for council discussion and questions.
Question? I'll have a quick question for you. You have the police station west area. If we did the 5-year without going to the voters for additional money, or can we be assured that we won't have a major need within that first 5 years, that we're okay to kind of hold back until the next 5?
Mayor, members of the council, with the existing voter authorization that we currently have, it would fund all the projects with the exception of the city court building. So it would include the Western Area Station also.
Okay, which buys us some time for the city court building, figure out what we're going to do there. Okay. All right, consensus? Yes.
Next steps, we do have the resolution for tonight's voting meeting. We'll update and make amendments to the resolution when we present the ballot language. We'll submit the ballot language to the county on June 19th. We have a meeting with the bond committee next week, and we'll start planning for the public outreach. We plan on doing 2 meetings or so every month. So we'll begin in August of 2020 through October of 2020 with the election on November 3rd of 2020. And that concludes our presentation. We'll open it up for questions.
Questions? Thank you. Okay, with that said, next item is the city manager's report. Mr. Phelps?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, just 3 quick items. First, I want to say that we received some good news today. Our interim director of community services, Jean Marino, has indicated that a round 2 of funding for our emergency solutions grant has come through. If you recall, we had received a grant for roughly $749,000 in round 1, and these are funds that are used for homeless and at-risk populations. And but the number we received today that we'll be able to apply to those programs is an additional $2.977 million, which will take us up to a total of about $3.7 million. This is excellent news. It comes at a time when our our at-risk populations can most need our support. And so good news there, and we'll keep you up to speed on that when we receive those funds. Also, just to let you know, we have submitted, Budget and Finance submitted the necessary paperwork for the approximately $29 million in pass-through funds from the federal government. And so we understand that some of the cities are actually starting to receive those monies in their account. And so we still are on track to receive those funds before the close of the budget year on June 30th. Finally, I've asked Deputy City Manager Rick St. John to come forward and to provide you an update information on our reconstitution plan as we reopen our facilities. And so with that, Rick.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. Just to give you a brief overview, we have a three-phase reconstitution plan. We're in phase 2 right now. Phase 2 is easily the most difficult of the 3 phases. Phase 1 was triggered by a relaxation of the stay-at-home order by the governor. When that occurred, we just started bringing some employees back from telecommuting and getting people acclimated to being back in the office. As social distancing and the ability to keep things disinfected allowed us to do, and that was done department by department. Each department head came in and spoke to a team that we put together to develop the recovery plan, and entering into phase 1 was a fairly simple process. Entering into phase 2, which we did this last Monday, was much more difficult. It was the reopening of City Hall, the reopening of the Foothills Recreation and Aquatic Center, and the reopening of some libraries. Now, I will tell you that libraries actually reopened in phase 1 based on staffing and the things that I described as far as physical distancing and the ability to keep the facility clean. We were able to open libraries sooner than we had originally anticipated, which was good. Our community has been going to those libraries. I think Foothills had 700 in a week. Main Library had roughly those numbers. Velmateague and Heroes slightly less, but still used very heavily by the community. What we're seeing today as far as libraries are concerned is people want to be able to use the computers in the libraries. And so we're working on a plan to move to a system that we can keep them clean, keep them separated enough that people can come in and use them on a scheduled basis and stay protected. Our goal, of course, is to open in a safe and healthy way that keeps not only our employees safe, but the community safe when they come and use these facilities and amenities. And there's some challenge to that, both in our abilities internally to keep things clean with the staffing levels that we have, and then with the community's ability to maintain physical distancing. For example, at the Foothills Recreation and Aquatic Center, we wanted to open the gymnasium, the jogging track, and the fitness center. Jogging track and fitness center, it's easier. You can shut down certain machines, make sure that people maintain distancing. We're closing every 90 minutes for a complete cleaning, and then allowing people to cycle through on 90-minute intervals Tuesday through Saturday, closed on Sunday and Monday. The gymnasium's a little more difficult. People want to play basketball, they want to play pickleball. I don't know how you maintain physical distancing doing that. So one of the things that we're looking at in how we're moving forward in our recovery plan are what are other cities doing. And we don't want to be too far ahead, and we don't want to be too far behind, because the community is going to have expectations based on what neighboring and bordering cities are doing. And so our Parks and Rec staff, our library staff, many other department directors in our city are talking to other people in other cities to make sure that we're all kind of moving at the same pace. And so far, that's worked very well for us. We will stay in phase 2 as long as we need to be in phase 2. Phase 3 is triggered by very minimal number of new cases in Maricopa County on a daily basis. I will tell you today, it feels like that's a long way off. And so while we're in phase 2, we're going to continue to reopen and move and progress towards a complete reopening as best we can. So it may be that we don't enter phase 3 until after the fall. It may be that through the summer and into the fall, we continue to have significant new cases, and that may be because of testing, and it may be because of other things reopening and people doing community together and spreading COVID a little differently than we've seen in the stay-at-home order. If that happens, that doesn't mean the city isn't going to completely reopen. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have fall programming. We are going to continue in phase 2 to look and see what's going on in our community, what people's expectations are, and what our staff can do so that we can continue to reopen in phase 2 as much as we can. And with, I think that's all I need to say for now.
And that concludes my report, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. City Attorney's report, Mr. Bailey.
No report, thank you.
Council item of special interest. Council has the opportunity to indicate topics that they'd like to have discussed by the council at future workshops. Mr. Aldama. Thank you. Councilmember Clark.
Nothing, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Hugh.
None, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Tomachoff.
Nothing today, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Turner.
Nothing today, Mayor.
Thank you, Vice Mayor.
Nothing today, Mayor.
And I have nothing myself. Can I get a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
So move.
I have a motion. Can I get a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second to go into executive session. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none. All in favor, vote aye.
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 Any opposed, vote nay. You guys do have it. Motion carries. We are going to recess for exec.
We're going to take a little break.